Section 1. The unstoppable hunger and the paradox hidden inside it. There is a kind of horror that sits quietly at the edge of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Not the screaming kind. Not the kind that announces itself with brass horns and demon fire and the stench of corruption pouring from some cracked-open rent in reality. It is the slow kind, the kind that moves in from the darkness between galaxies, patient as geology, ancient as starlight. It does not want your soul. It does not want your worship. It does not want your territory, your surrender, your promise of obedience, or your undying devotion to a dark and whispering God. It does not, in any meaningful sense, want anything you could offer it as a trade. It wants your flesh, your bones, the moisture in your blood, and the proteins locked in your cells, and the carbon chain structures that hold your tissue together. Every living thing, on every world, that you have ever loved or visited or heard stories about or merely knew existed somewhere out there among the stars. All of it, gone, reduced to biological soup, and pumped through enormous organic tubes into waiting ships that drift in the orbit where your world used to have weather and seasons and oceans and the ordinary miracle of life going about its ordinary business, completely unaware that something was always going to come for it eventually. We call them the Tyranids, and they are hungry in a way that language was never really built to describe. The Great Devourer. That is what the peoples of the Imperium call them when they speak of them at all, which most do not, because there is a very human instinct to avoid naming the thing that frightens you most, as if the silence might keep it from noticing you. But the Tyranids have already noticed. The hive mind, that vast and alien metasentience that drives every creature in every fleet, has already tasted the psychic light of the Astronomicon from somewhere in the cold void between galaxies. It has already begun the long crawl inward toward the warmth and life of the Milky Way, drawn to it the way a fire draws moths, except that in this scenario, the moths are each the size of a continent, and they intend to eat the flame entire, and they have never failed to consume a fire once they decided they wanted it. What makes the Tyranids genuinely unique among the nightmares of Warhammer 40,000 is that they operate on a scale that makes even the most catastrophic human wars feel almost intimate by comparison. The orcs fight because fighting is the point, because the peculiar biology of the greenskin species generates psychic energy from conflict, and that energy makes them stronger. And they have decided collectively, if not consciously, that stronger is better and fighting is good. And the combination of those two things is basically everything worth knowing about existence. Chaos wages its eternal campaign of corruption and damnation because its gods feed on the emotions of mortal souls, because corn grows fat on bloodshed, and Tzeentch thrives on change, and Nurgle drinks deep from despair, and Slaanesh consumes the most exquisite experiences, both beautiful and terrible. Even these motivations, alien as they are, have some echo of recognizable desire at their center. The Necrons pursue cold dominion, the reclamation of an ancient empire built when the first ancestors of humanity were still learning what fire was. You can at least map their goals against human motivations, even if the scale is staggering and the coldness of their calculation is deeply unnerving to spend time thinking about. The Tyranids simply consume. They have no ideology beneath the consumption. They have no cruelty that serves a purpose beyond the immediate calculus of energy expenditure versus biomass gained. They do not hate you. They are as indifferent to your suffering as the ocean is indifferent to the drowning of a single sailor. You are material. You are resource. You are food. And the machine has been optimized across millions of years of biological pressure to process food with a thoroughness and efficiency that would be genuinely admirable if it were not so catastrophic for everything that qualifies as food, and for all the terror this inspires, for all the ink spilled, and all the battles lost, and all the world stripped to bare rock and perfect silence, there exists a question that almost no one in the 41st millennium has the luxury of sitting down to seriously consider. A question that feels almost absurd on the surface, but becomes something genuinely unsettling the longer you turn it over in your mind, like a stone in your pocket that you keep finding yourself touching. What are the Tyranids afraid of? Because here is the thing about a species that is, by every measurable metric, one of the most dangerous forces in the known universe. A species that has devoured entire galaxies before our own, that adapts faster than any conventional weapons program can counter, that replaces its losses from the very biomass of its victims, that cannot be reasoned with, or bargained with, or frightened by the prospect of death, because individual death means nothing to a hive mind that thinks in terms of trillions. A species that spreads its advanced scouts, those insidious genostealers, across target worlds decades or even centuries before the main fleet arrives, letting the infection build slowly in the dark until the population that should be defending the world is riddled through with hybrids who will open the gates from the inside when the time comes. Because the hive mind is patient in a way that biological organisms with individual lifespans simply cannot conceptualize. A species like that should be afraid of nothing. And yet there are places in the lore where the hive mind flinches. There are records, buried in the classified archives of the Ordo Xenos and the exhausted debriefs of inquisitors, who have spent their entire careers studying the swarm from as close as they dared get, of hive fleets making course corrections that have no straightforward tactical explanation, of tendrils that withdraw from perfectly viable targets, of the hive mind showing something that, if you squint at it from the right angle and in the right light and with the right decades of experience to contextualize what you are seeing, looks almost like caution, like the very deliberate act of something vast and cold and calculating, deciding that a particular problem is not worth the cost it would extract to solve. Not fear, exactly. The hive mind is not human enough for fear in the way we understand it. Fear, for us, is a survival response built by evolution to keep an individual organism alive long enough to reproduce. The hive mind does not have an individual survival response because it does not think in terms of individual survival, but something functions like fear within it, something that responds to certain categories of threat the way a hand responds to heat, not through deliberate decision, but through something more immediate and more fundamental. A cold, computational recognition that certain things are bad for the swarm, and that the swarm should route around them when possible, the same way a river routes around stone without making a decision to do so. Understanding what those things are tells you something important, not just about the Tyranids, but about the fundamental nature of the 40K universe and the strange and terrible logic that holds it together. Because, in a setting where everything is already as bad as it can possibly be on any given Tuesday, the things that give the hive mind pause are among the most revealing and most fascinating corners of the lore. So, settle in. We are going to walk through all of it. The biological vulnerabilities hidden inside what looks from the outside like a perfect killing machine. The factional threats that the swarm genuinely struggles to process. The fundamental physical laws that no amount of evolution can engineer around. And perhaps most unsettling of all, the thing lurking somewhere in the dark, beyond the edge of the galaxy, that may have driven the Tyranids here in the first place. Because if something scared the Great Devourer badly enough to send it fleeing toward us, we should probably want to know what it is. But first, we need to understand what the Tyranids actually are, properly and in some depth, because the surface-level description is not enough to make the vulnerabilities comprehensible. It is not enough to say they have chitinous carapaces and scything talons and an endless reproductive cycle, though all of that is true and all of it matters. The thing that makes the Tyranids genuinely extraordinary as a fictional horror is the architecture of their consciousness, the hive mind. Because once you understand how the hive mind actually functions, the vulnerabilities become visible in the structure of the thing itself, and the things that have no obvious vulnerabilities become terrifying in a completely different and much more satisfying way. The hive mind is not a single creature sitting somewhere at the center of the fleet, pulling strings. It is not a queen with attendants making decisions and passing them down a command hierarchy the way most people who have watched too many insect documentaries imagine. It is something more like a distributed consciousness, a vast psychic network that links every single Tyranid organism in a fleet into a single cohesive intelligence. Every Hormigaunt scrabbling across a shattered battlefield is not acting on personal instinct. Every Carnifex smashing through a fortified building is not expressing personal aggression. They are expressions of a single will, extensions of a single thought, in the same way that your fingers are extensions of a decision your brain made without you consciously attending to the mechanics of how that decision traveled down your nervous system. The scale of this is almost impossible to hold in mind all at once. We are talking about a consciousness that might encompass trillions of individual organisms spread across multiple star systems, all of them feeding sensory data back into a central processing structure and receiving orders in return with a speed and efficiency that no human communication technology has ever approached. Because this is not electromagnetic communication or astropathic relay or any other system that physics can disrupt. It is direct psychic connection, mind to hive and hive to mind, instantaneous in its functioning, because it operates on dimensions that are adjacent to, but not identical with, the dimensions where light has a speed limit. This is the source of the Tyranids' greatest strength. An army that moves as one organism, that shares tactical data in real time across its entire deployed force, that can redirect a creature's purpose mid-stride without any verbal command, is an army that fights with a fluidly intelligent efficiency that no conventionally coordinated military force can match. There are no miscommunications. There are no chain of command failures. There are no junior officers making bad decisions because they lack the strategic context their seniors have. Every organism in the swarm has, in a sense, the full strategic picture at whatever level of abstraction its biological function requires. The hive tyrants and warriors, who serve as intermediate nodes in the psychic hierarchy, carry the hive mind's intent and translate it into the local context, and the organisms under their influence execute that intent with the kind of precision that makes human military planners deeply uncomfortable to read about in the post-battle reports. And it is also, as we will explore in considerable detail, the location of one of the few genuine and exploitable weak points in the entire Tyranid architecture. But there is something else worth establishing before we move forward into the main discussion. The Tyranids came from outside our galaxy. Whatever else is true about them, that much is not in dispute. They crossed the intergalactic void, a journey measured in millions of light years through absolute darkness, with no stars and no planets and nothing to consume, and they did it on whatever biomass they had stored from whatever galaxy they last finished processing. The engineering calculations that human minds have attempted to perform on this journey, working backward from the known biology of Tyranid organisms and the known distances involved, produce numbers that do not make sense under conventional assumptions. The Tyranids should have starved long before reaching us. The energy budget does not balance under any generous model available to human science. They did not starve, they are here. Which means either the intergalactic void is not quite as empty as the astronomers assumed, and there are things out there, between galaxies, that could feed a swarm in transit, which raises its own disturbing questions about what the void actually contains. Or the Tyranids spent most of that crossing in something like hibernation, coasting on stored resources with their metabolic processes slowed to near nothing for millions of years, essentially dormant, but carrying the potential for resumption that an intact and cold-preserved hive fleet represents. Or, and this is the theory that keeps certain inquisitors awake past the time when a sensible person would have gone to bed and made peace with the universe, something gave them a reason to move very, very quickly. Something that made the expenditure not just worth it, but necessary. Something that did not give the swarm the option of conserving energy through a more leisurely approach, because delay was not survivable. We will come back to that. Hold on to it carefully, because it is the thread that everything else eventually pulls toward. For now, drop a comment below and let us know where you are watching from and what time it is there. There is something about talking about cosmic horror that makes me want to know who else is awake in the world right now. And if you have not subscribed yet, now would be a good moment. We are just getting started, and what comes next is considerably more unsettling than the introduction. Section 2. The Synapse Network, the hidden crack in the machine. To understand the Tyranids' most fundamental and most consistently exploited vulnerability, you need to understand Synapse, not as an abstract game mechanic pulled from a rulebook, but as a biological reality with specific and detailed consequences when it fails. Because in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, the Synapse Network is everything. It is the nervous system of the swarm made manifest in physical space, extended across kilometers of active battlefield, projected through the skulls of specific specialist organisms called synapse creatures, and without it, the entire beautiful and terrifying machine stops being a machine and becomes something considerably more manageable. Here is how it works in mechanical detail. The hive mind cannot directly control every organism in a deployed swarm from a distance of light years. Even its psychic reach, extraordinary as it is by any scale of measurement, has practical limits at extreme range. So it works through a hierarchy, a nested system of psychic intermediaries that extends the hive mind's will through layers of delegation while maintaining the essential coherence of the swarm's consciousness. At the upper levels of this hierarchy are the great hive ships and the Norn queens, those colossal breeding and processing organisms that float in the void above target worlds, coordinating the broadest strategic decisions and manufacturing the next generation of bioforms from the biomass being processed below. Below them are the hive tyrants, massive six-limbed creatures of extraordinary intelligence and genuinely alarming individual psychic power, who function as generals in every meaningful sense of the word, carrying the hive mind's strategic will and projecting it outward in a powerful psychic field called synapse. Within that field, lesser organisms receive their orders not as explicit thought commands but as biological imperative, as sure and as inescapable as hunger or the need to breathe, hardwired at the level of nervous system function. They do not deliberate about which enemy to charge. They do not weigh options against each other. They simply act, with perfect coordination and perfect efficiency, because the hive mind has already done all the deliberating for them, and the result has been transmitted directly into their bodies as something indistinguishable from instinct. Below the hive tyrants in this chain are additional layers of synapse-capable organisms. Tyranid warriors, those mid-sized and impressively lethal creatures that function operationally like sergeants among the swarm, project their own synapse fields of smaller radius around themselves. Broodlords, the apex versions of genostealers that are terrifying in their own right as individual combatants, maintain synapse presence within their local area of influence. The result is a layered and theoretically redundant network, a nested hierarchy of psychic control that extends the hive mind's coordination from the flagship bioship all the way down to the most basic and expendable ripper, that tiny three-mouthed organism whose entire biological purpose is to consume the dead and return their matter to the biological cycle. When everything is functioning as designed, this system is genuinely frightening in its perfection. There are no supply lines to cut. There are no command bunkers to destroy. There are no generals who make catastrophically bad decisions under pressure, no armies that rout when losses become too severe, no soldiers who surrender because they are tired and frightened and cannot see the point of continuing. Every creature acts as part of the whole, and the whole is guided by a consciousness that does not feel any of those things. It does not feel fatigue or terror or despair or the temptation to retreat and try again another day. It learns from every casualty in real time and adjusts the deployment of its remaining assets accordingly, and the learning is encoded into the next generation of organisms, so that not even death forgets what was discovered in the fighting. But there is always a but, and in the Tyranids' case, this one is genuinely significant. Sever the synapse link, and what happens to the lesser organisms cut off beneath it is, from a military perspective, among the most dramatic reversals in any battlefield engagement. A hormigaunt that is suddenly isolated from synapse does not become a free agent making independent tactical decisions. It does not use the sudden absence of external direction to develop its own strategic priorities or evaluate its situation with clear eyes and decide on the most rational course of action. It reverts. It becomes what it biologically is, underneath all that psychic scaffolding, which is an animal. A dangerous animal. Absolutely. An animal with scything blades designed to shear through ceramite armor and a body built through millions of years of biological optimization for hunting and killing. But an animal whose behavior is now governed by basic drives rather than the hive mind's sophisticated tactical assessment, and that difference in governing principle is enormous in practical terms. And crucially, that animal's behavior becomes unpredictable in a way that actively works against the swarm's cohesion. It attacks whatever is closest. It responds to immediate threat rather than executing a plan. It may turn on other Tyranid organisms in its immediate vicinity if they happen to be the nearest available target and its most basic territorial instincts override whatever remains of the coordination instinct. The precision swarm that was advancing on a specific weak point in the defensive line seconds ago is now a collection of confused, feral creatures that can be managed with the tools you manage confused, feral creatures with, which is to say, with firm defensive positions and patient, disciplined fire, rather than the desperate and exhausting scramble for survival that a coherent Tyranid assault requires. In the most extreme cases, and these are documented in sufficient detail in the historical records of the Tyrannic Wars to be treated as reliable data rather than battlefield mythology, the psychic shock of a synapse creature's death cascades through the organisms linked to it with enough force to simply kill them outright. The neural feedback of a suddenly severed synapse connection tears through the underdeveloped individual nervous systems of lesser organisms like a power surge through unprotected electronics. The creatures collapse, not wounded, not routing, dead, with no visible external cause, struck down by the loss of the psychic presence that was, in a very real neurological sense, the most essential component of their conscious function. The thread connecting them to something larger than themselves simply snapping, and the snap itself being lethal. Frontline commanders who have survived Tyranid engagements describe witnessing this phenomenon with a kind of stunned disbelief, even when they were intellectually prepared for it. You are in the middle of what might genuinely be the last defensive action you ever fight. The creatures are coming, and the losses are mounting, and the ammunition count is falling towards zero, and then something changes. The creatures slow, they stumble. Some of them stop entirely mid-stride, as if someone has switched off whatever was powering their directed purpose. After a moment, they either lapse into confused and individually manageable animal behavior, or they simply fall where they stood. And somewhere behind the enemy's previous position, if you have the resources to send investigative teams afterward, you will find a hive tyrant that went down. Sometimes to a sniper who identified the priority target across 400 meters of chaos and made a single perfect shot. Sometimes to a well-placed plasma round that found a joint in the carapace. Sometimes to a coordinated push by a squad of space marines who identified the synapse creature as the objective and expended everything they had to put it down, knowing that this one kill was worth more than 100 other kills on the board. This is why so much of anti-Tyranid doctrine, across every faction that has developed any formal doctrine for facing the swarm, focuses so heavily on identifying and prioritizing synapse creature elimination as the primary tactical objective, above and before the reduction of the swarm's overall numbers. It is a lesson purchased at enormous cost across the First, Second, and Third Tyrannic Wars. Marneus Calgar, the chapter master of the Ultramarines who survived the Battle of Macragge and carried those lessons in his enhanced body and his deliberate institutional memory for the rest of his extended life, understood this at a visceral level that went well beyond abstract strategic theory. The Tau, as we will discuss in considerable detail later, built entire tactical doctrines around the precise identification and rapid elimination of synapse creatures, and that doctrine contributed materially to the outcome they achieved against Hive Fleet Gorgon, one of the very few actual decisive victories against a full Hive Fleet in the recorded history of Tyrannic War. The Death Watch, those Space Marine kill teams dedicated specifically to Xenos threats, treat synapse termination as essentially their primary consideration when deploying against Tyranid forces, sometimes at the expense of objectives that would seem more immediately important to an observer not familiar with the underlying biology. The trick, and the thing that prevents this from being a clean and easily replicable solution to the Tyranid problem, is that the hive mind knows its own architecture. It has known the vulnerability of the synapse hierarchy from the moment the first defenders exploited it successfully against the swarm. It absorbed that data along with the biomass of the world's population and filed it in whatever serves as the hive mind's strategic memory. And the filing process is not passive. The hive mind responds to information the way all living systems respond to environmental pressures. It adapts. It changes its deployment. It engineers redundancy into the system. It ensures that future fleets do not make the same mistake twice if a biological solution to the problem exists. By the time Hive Fleet Kraken arrived in 993, M41, approximately 2.5 centuries after the destruction of Behemoth, The swarm had incorporated everything it had learned from the first engagement into the structure and deployment doctrine of the new fleet. Kraken did not advance as a single enormous mass, presenting large and obvious synapse creature targets to the defenders' weapons. It splintered. Dozens and eventually hundreds of semi-autonomous tendrils, each one self-contained with its own complete layered synapse hierarchy, attacking across such a vast front simultaneously that no defensive force could focus its resources effectively against all of them at once. Kill a hive tyrant in one tendril, and that tendril fractured. But the tendril immediately adjacent, and the one beyond that, and the dozens of others spread across 100 light-years of contested space, kept moving with perfect coherence because each one had its own independent synapse chain, and the death of one link did not propagate weakness to any of the others. The synapse vulnerability is real. It is probably the most consistently exploitable weakness in the Tyranid architecture in any single tactical engagement, but it is a weakness the hive mind is fully aware of and has been actively engineering around since the earliest confirmed contact. Every generation of organisms shows refinements in synapse range, redundancy of hierarchy, and the capacity of certain secondary organism types to take on emergency synapse function if primary carriers are lost in combat. What was a relatively clean and reliable vulnerability in the earliest tyrannic engagements has become, over the course of 3 major wars and hundreds of smaller campaigns, a much better guarded crack in the architecture that requires increasingly sophisticated and coordinated effort to exploit effectively. There is also a dimension of the synapse network that rewards contemplation beyond the strictly tactical for those who find horror in biological implications rather than simply in the immediate danger of combat. What does synapse mean for the individual Tyranid organism as an experience of existence? The lesser organisms, the Gaunts and the Rippers and the Gargoyles, and all the countless specialist forms that fill every tactical role in the swarm, are not built for independent consciousness in any meaningful sense. They are constructed, specifically and deliberately, to be extensions of a greater mind rather than minds in their own right. The hive mind does not create individual soldiers and then connect them to a network. It creates components that are only functional as components, pieces of a machine that cannot serve as standalone units because they were never designed to be standalone units. What this means is that an organism outside synapse range is not simply an individual who has lost their communications link to headquarters and must now operate on their last issued orders. It is something closer to a brain cell that has been physically separated from the brain. The tissue is alive, the biochemical processes continue, but the thing that made it a brain cell, its integration into a larger structure, the context that gave its activity meaning, is gone. And the resulting behavior reflects that loss with an eerie biological accuracy that unsettles human observers even when they know intellectually what they are watching. The broader point is that the synapse architecture represents the hive mind's greatest tactical strength and its most accessible strategic weakness in the same breath. An enemy that can exploit it efficiently and consistently wins battles. An enemy that cannot exploit it, or that faces the evolved Tyranid response to such exploitation, generally does not win at all. The question underlying everything else in this discussion is whether there exist categories of threat that operate entirely outside this framework. Threats that do not need to find and target synapse creatures because they attack the hive mind at a level that is not addressable through the layered synapse hierarchy at all. Threats that the hive mind cannot route around, cannot adapt to biologically, and cannot solve by throwing more organisms at the problem. The answer to that question is the most disturbing thing we are going to discuss today. But we need to build up to it properly, walking through each layer of the picture before we arrive at the center. Section 3. The biomass dependency, starving the devourer. There is a certain grim genius in the way the Tyranids sustain themselves. It is one of the most elegantly horrible biological systems in all of speculative fiction, and understanding it fully is essential to understanding why the people of the Imperium, and a handful of particularly far-sighted inquisitors, who had the ruthlessness to think the problem all the way through, eventually arrived at the realization that fighting the Tyranids in the conventional military sense might be exactly the wrong approach. The Tyranids do not have supply lines the way conventional armies do. They do not maintain manufacturing infrastructure, producing weapons and equipment at secure facilities behind the front lines. They do not have fuel depots or ammunition dumps, or the sprawling and vulnerable logistical chains that make conventional military operations possible, but also provide opponents with things to target and disrupt. Their supply chain is the enemy. More precisely, their supply chain is the biological content of every world and every being that exists in the path of their advance. Every world they consume becomes the raw material for new organisms. Every casualty they inflict, including and especially their own dead, is recycled through the biological systems that the swarm deploys on the surface of every contested world. The digestion pools, those vast and disturbing organic structures that form as part of the invasion architecture and dissolve everything biological into a thick nutrient soup without any discrimination between species or origin, break down the bodies of friend and foe alike. The capillary towers, enormous organic structures that grow from the planet's surface up through the atmosphere into the orbital space above, pump that biological soup upward into the waiting bioships. The Norn Queens process the incoming raw material and use it to manufacture new organisms tailored to the current campaign's specific needs and the lessons the ongoing battle has taught. The Tyranids win, and the swarm grows larger and more capable. They absorb their own losses and the enemy's losses simultaneously and without preference. The battlefield itself feeds the army that is fighting on it. This is what makes them almost impossible to fight to a permanent conclusion through conventional attrition alone. Every soldier you kill is eventually biomass for the next wave of replacements. Every defensive line you hold has to be held indefinitely because there is no point at which the swarm runs out of reinforcements that can be manufactured from within the local theater. It is a closed-loop system at the tactical level, and within that loop, the Tyranids are almost certainly going to win any war of attrition you are willing to offer them, regardless of how well you fight it. But the closed loop is only closed while the swarm is winning its engagements, while it is consuming worlds and processing biomass at a rate faster than it is expending organisms in combat, while the math of intake versus expenditure stays positive. And this is where the critical and often underappreciated vulnerability actually lives. A hive fleet that is spending more biomass on producing and deploying organisms than it is recovering from its victories is a hive fleet that is, in the most literal biological sense, dying. Not quickly, not with any drama visible from outside, quietly and imperceptibly at first, until the signs begin to accumulate in ways that a sufficiently expert observer can read. The organisms begin to arrive smaller, less complex. The metabolic budget that previously supported the production of large and expensive bioforms, like carnifexes, gets squeezed as the reserves draw down. The hive tyrants that served as the swarm's senior commanders become harder to replace when they fall. Even the extraordinary adaptability that makes the swarm so dangerous requires enormous biological resources to maintain at full speed, and if those resources are not incoming at sufficient rate, the adaptation slows, and the swarm becomes less creative in its biological responses. The swarm remains dangerous in this state. A starving Tyranid swarm is still an unimaginable catastrophe for any world it reaches, because even a depleted hive fleet represents more military force than most individual systems can resist. But it is dangerous the way a starving predator is dangerous, which is unpredictably and desperately, rather than with the cold and surgical precision that makes a well-fed and fully resourced hive fleet the existential threat it is described as in the strategic assessments. This discovery, worked out through painful experience and generations of casualties, led the most calculating minds studying the Tyranid threat to a deeply uncomfortable conclusion. If you cannot beat the swarm by fighting it directly, because fighting it directly feeds it even when you win, you must find a way to deny it what it needs. The strategy shifts from trying to destroy the enemy army to making the battlefield itself empty, from fighting the Tyranids to starving them. Inquisitor Lord Fidus, Cryptman of the Ordo, Xenos, arrived at this conclusion before anyone else with the institutional authority to act on it. He had spent decades studying the swarm. He had been present in various capacities during the wars against Behemoth and Kraken. He had watched worlds die with a clear-eyed calculation that earned him a reputation among his fellow Inquisitors as either the most ruthless pragmatist the Ordo had produced or someone who had crossed a line that even the Inquisition preferred to pretend still existed. And when Hive Fleet Leviathan appeared in 997 M41, he concluded based on everything he had learned that the conventional response was a losing strategy in the long term. Leviathan was the largest Tyranid incursion in recorded history, and it arrived from below the galactic plane, a direction from which no threat had ever been anticipated. It attacked at multiple points simultaneously, with a tactical sophistication that combined everything the hive mind had absorbed from 2 previous major wars and hundreds of smaller engagements. Leviathan was enormous, strategically disciplined, and moving with a speed that made the normal timeline for mobilizing a defensive response look entirely inadequate. Kryptman ordered a cordon sanitaire, a quarantine zone of total devastation established across dozens of worlds directly in the path of Leviathan's advance. And then he ordered those worlds sterilized before the Tyranids reached them, not evacuated, not fortified and defended, destroyed, exterminatus. The most extreme and irreversible action available to the Imperium, the complete sterilization of a planetary surface, typically implemented through cyclonic torpedoes that generate nucleonic fire or raw plasma reactions, capable of killing every living thing on the planet and rendering the surface biologically inert for centuries, dead worlds. Stone and silence, and nothing for the swarm to process. The cold logic Kryptman was operating on is not difficult to follow if you are willing to follow it all the way down without flinching. A dead world offers the hive fleet nothing. No biomass to consume, no atmosphere to strip, no oceans to drink, no populations to dissolve into nutrient soup. A hive fleet that crosses a band of sterile and empty systems is spending organisms and stored energy with no recovery on the other side. It is burning its biological reserves without replenishment. If the band of sterility is wide enough and the hive fleet's reserves are limited enough, the mathematics of biology eventually flip and begin working against the swarm rather than for it. The price of this strategy was the people who lived on those worlds, people who had families and communities and small daily lives that meant everything to them and nothing whatsoever to the calculation Kryptman was running. People who were, in his framework, acceptable losses in the arithmetic of species-level survival. The Imperium's censure of his decision, the eventual stripping of his inquisitorial rank, and his formal exile reflects how far outside even the Imperium's very flexible moral boundaries his choices had gone. But the cordon demonstrably worked. The leading tendrils of Leviathan, advancing with the terrifying inevitability that had characterized the first phases of every previous hive fleet invasion, began showing behavioral signs in areas of heavy cordon application that the Ordo Xenos analysts documented carefully. The word they kept circling back to, qualified extensively and hedged with caveats, was strain. The hive mind's forward elements appeared to recognize that the biomass budget was not balancing as expected, and this recognition produced behavioral responses that looked, in the strategic record, like an organism under resource stress, shifting from optimal toward opportunistic foraging, reaching toward whatever biomass was available, rather than driving along the original planned vector. This diversion behavior is precisely what you expect from a biological organism experiencing resource stress. When the environment is rich, efficient predators move directly toward the highest value targets by the shortest available route. When the environment becomes depleted, the same predators shift to broader and less discriminating foraging that prioritizes finding anything over finding the optimal thing. The hive fleet behaved as a biological organism under resource stress because that is exactly what it is. Resource stress is a universal biological experience that does not care how many galaxies your species has consumed before the current campaign. The broader lesson here matters enormously for understanding what the Tyranids are functionally afraid of. The hive mind is not changed by individual military defeats. It is not affected by the deaths of enormous numbers of organisms in the way that a human military force is affected by casualties. But it is affected by the failure of the biological equation to balance, by the gap between expected resource recovery and actual resource recovery growing large enough to produce measurable consequences in the quality and composition of deployed forces. Starving the devourer is not a comfortable solution. It requires sacrificing the very populations you are trying to protect, and the scale of sacrifice required to implement it at strategic level exceeds anything that a moral framework would endorse. But it is a genuine lever. The Tyranids have a dependency that cannot be engineered away, and that dependency is the crack in the machine that every other successful anti-Tyranid strategy is ultimately built on, whether explicitly or not. Section 4. The Necrons, the meal that fights back and offers nothing in return. Buried deep in the Codex entries and the campaign supplements and the scattered communiques of Ordo Xenos Inquisitors who have dedicated their careers to mapping the behavior patterns of the swarm, there is a detail that rewards careful attention. In the 5th edition Tyranid Codex, the official record maintained by the scholars of the Imperium, there is an explicit mention of something that should be, given everything we know about Tyranid behavior, essentially impossible. 2 minor tendrils of Hive Fleet Behemoth, the first great fleet to assault the galaxy in force, made significant and deliberate course corrections. Not minor adjustments to avoid a tactical obstacle, major navigational redirections that rerouted significant portions of the fleet's advance, to avoid direct conflict with the Necrons of Solemnes. Hold that thought for a moment. This is a species that, in its very structure and function, does not possess the concept of strategic withdrawal as anything other than a temporary repositioning for advantage. A species that has documented adaptations designed specifically to prevent its organisms from retreating or surrendering even when the tactical situation is clearly hopeless, because individual loss is irrelevant at the scale the hive mind operates on. A species that kept advancing at the Battle of Macragge long after any conventional military force would have recognized the engagement as unwinnable, because the hive mind was counting organisms and calculating that there were still enough to take the objective, even at the cost of everything that had already been committed. This species redirected around a Necron world, not because it lacked the numbers or the firepower to engage, because the risk-reward calculation came out wrong. This has happened more than once. Multiple sources across different editions of the lore describe instances of Tyranid fleets making unexplained course corrections around worlds that later investigative probes confirmed were Necron tomb sites. And in every case, the behavior is the same. Not a failed attack that caused a withdrawal, not a defeat that forced a retreat, a proactive avoidance. A choice, if we want to use that word carefully, without implying human-style deliberation, to not engage, to route around, to prioritize other targets over what sits on that particular world. What does the hive mind know about the Necrons that it has not told anyone else? The first and most obvious answer is the biomass problem we established in the previous section. Necrons are living metal, not metal that contains living things. Metal that is itself alive, or something adjacent to life, the ancient Necrontyr consciousness transferred into necrodermis, an artificial material that can self-repair, self-reassemble, and return to functional operation after damage that would destroy any biological organism many times over. There is nothing there to consume in any conventional biological sense. No flesh, no fluid, no organic chemistry to break down in the digestion pools. A Tyranid swarm that destroys a Necron warrior gains nothing from the victory. The energy spent killing it cannot be recovered by dissolving it into nutrient soup. The warrior is not organic. It does not go through the digestion pool. And then, with the particular cosmic unfairness that makes the Necrons such a troubling enemy for everyone they face, the warrior reassembles itself, and the energy has to be spent again. This is not a trivial concern. The Tyranid equation is always and continuously about net biomass flow. A Necron engagement throws that equation into deeply unfavorable territory almost immediately, and keeps it there for the duration of the engagement. Every other enemy the Tyranids face, even enemies that fight brilliantly and exact a terrible toll on the swarm, eventually dies. Their bodies go through the digestion pools. Their biological content enters the cycle. Even space marine bodies, armored and augmented as they are, eventually get dissolved and return value to the swarm. The Necrons do not enter the cycle. They simply do not. And in the hive mind's arithmetic, an enemy that cannot be consumed is an enemy that represents pure cost with no offsetting recovery. Every engagement, is a guaranteed net loss of resources. But this still does not fully explain the scale of the avoidance behavior, because if it were purely an economic calculation, the Tyranids might simply accept the cost and prioritize the biomass they could gain from the Necron's surrounding star systems. The records suggest something more is going on, and that something connects to the specific nature of Necron technology. Gauss weaponry, the signature ranged armament of most Necron warrior units, is not simply a powerful shooting weapon. Its mechanism of effect is specifically terrifying from a biological perspective in a way that goes beyond raw stopping power. Gauss technology does not function by punching holes in things or burning through them with concentrated energy. It strips matter at the molecular level, unraveling the chemical bonds that hold physical structure together, disassembling biological material from the surface inward with a methodical efficiency that, once you understand what it is doing, is genuinely disturbing to contemplate. There is no carapace rating that provides resistance to molecular disassembly. There is no adaptation available for an exoskeleton that makes you resistant to having your cellular structure stripped layer by layer from the outside in. This matters enormously because adaptation is the Tyranid's supreme weapon, and adaptation requires that the threat being adapted to operates within the parameters that biological engineering can address. If a weapon causes physical trauma, you can breed heavier armor. If a weapon uses thermal energy, you can breed reflective biological structures. If a weapon uses kinetic impact, you can breed denser tissue. The entire history of Tyranid military adaptation is a catalog of biological responses to physical threats, and almost every physical threat has a biological response available, because almost every physical threat operates within the envelope of what organic matter, structured correctly, can endure or deflect. Gauss weaponry operates below that level. It operates at the fundamental chemistry of matter, and below the chemistry of matter, biological adaptation has no tools to work with, because biological adaptation is itself built on chemistry. You cannot breed an organism that is immune to having its atoms rearranged, because the organism's atoms are the organism. Add to this the dolmen gates, those ancient Necron artifacts that allow transit through the webway without entering the warp. This matters enormously in the Tyranid strategic context because one of the most powerful tools the Hive fleet uses to isolate prey worlds is the shadow in the warp. That massive psychic disruption that blankets all of local space around the fleet and makes warp travel and communication impossible for every species that uses the warp. The Necrons are completely immune to this effect. They do not travel through the warp. Their communications are not psychic in the warp-connected sense. The shadow in the warp, which for the Imperium represents perhaps the single most tactically crippling element of a Tyranid invasion, does not isolate the Necrons. They can call for and receive reinforcements while operating inside the shadow's range. They can coordinate across star systems while every other faction in the area is effectively deaf and blind. The Great Equalizer does not equalize anything against the Necrons. And then there is the Silent King, Sarek, who looms over all of these tactical considerations with the weight of 60 million years of history and a perspective that no living being in the current era can fully match. Sarek was the last of the three silent kings of all the Necron dynasties, the supreme ruler who led his people into the catastrophe of biotransference, who watched as the souls of the Necrontyr were consumed by the Cetan in exchange for immortal metal bodies, who then led the revolt that shattered the Cetan into manageable fragments, but could not undo what had been done to his people. Afterward, in something that functions as guilt so deep and old that it has become philosophical rather than emotional, he exiled himself, left the galaxy, spent millions of years wandering the intergalactic void while his people slept their great sleep across 10,000 tomb worlds. In the void, he encountered the Tyranids, not a tendril, not a splinter fleet, the thing itself, or something close enough to the thing itself, that the encounter changed the Silent King's calculations about everything, including his exile. He returned. After millions of years of deliberate absence, he came back to his sleeping empire and began the enormous effort of waking it, specifically because he recognized what the Tyranids were and what they would do to the Milky Way if they were not opposed. His great work, as it is called in the Necron sources, is the construction of a coalition of resistance, the unification of the Necron dynasties, and potentially the recruitment of other species to the cause of facing the swarm together. The Silent King is, in a strange and remarkable way, one of the most clear-eyed observers of the Tyranid threat in the entire setting. He has seen them from a vantage point no one else has. He has a respect for their capabilities that is not softened by hope or faith or pride. He knows exactly what the Tyranids are. And the fact that this knowledge drove him back from 60 million years of self-imposed exile says something that no tactical analysis quite captures. For the hive mind, the Necrons represent the convergence of multiple categories of problem that individually cause difficulty and collectively produce something much more serious: no biomass return. Weapon technology that resists biological adaptation at the most fundamental level. Strategic mobility, immune to the shadow in the warp. Resurrection capability that breaks the attrition model entirely. And an ancient intelligence at their summit that has actually studied the Tyranids in the deep void and returned specifically to oppose them. The course corrections around Necron worlds are not fear in the human sense, but they are the hive mind's version of the same recognition that brought the Silent King back from exile. The recognition that this particular problem does not yield to the standard approach, and that the standard approach applied to the wrong target destroys resources that could be used against actual prey. Section 5. The Warp and Chaos. When the Predator meets the Immaterial. Of all the strange and layered interactions in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, the one between the Tyranids and the forces of chaos is perhaps the most philosophically interesting to unpack, because it is not a conventional enemy relationship, and it is not a neutral one, and it is not a cooperative one either. It is something more complicated than any of those categories, something that emerges from the fundamental nature of both entities and produces an interaction that is simultaneously deeply unsatisfying for both sides and deeply strange in its broader implications for the war, for the galaxy. The short version is this: the Tyranids and the entities of chaos cannot really consume each other in any meaningful way, and that mutual indigestibility creates a kind of accidental standoff that has real strategic consequences far beyond any individual engagement between the two forces. Let us start with what chaos actually is, in terms that the hive mind would care about. The warp, the Imperium, the realm of chaos, these are all names for the same thing. A parallel dimension that exists in a shadow relationship with the material universe, where the psychic and emotional residue of every sentient being with a soul accumulates and gradually coalesces into the great and terrible entities we know as the Chaos Gods, and the vast and varied army of daemons and lesser entities that serve them. Daemons are not biological in any conventional sense. They are made of psychic energy, of solidified emotion, of warp stuff that has been given temporary shape and direction and purpose by the will of entities vast enough to encompass entire emotional states across the whole of galactic history. What can the Tyranids do with a creature made of solidified emotion? In the most literal terms, they can fight it, because daemons that manifest in the material realm do have physical presence and can be destroyed in the material sense. There are records of Tyranid organisms consuming daemon flesh when it is physically manifested, but the return on that consumption is essentially nothing. Warp energy does not translate into the proteins and amino acid chains and organic chemistry that the Norn Queens need to build new organisms. So even when the Tyranids successfully destroy daemon manifestations, the victory costs organisms and gains nothing. Pure expenditure with no recovery. The worst possible transaction from the hive mind's perspective. On the other side of this equation, the daemons of chaos gain nothing from destroying Tyranids either, and for equally fundamental reasons. The Chaos Gods feed on emotion, on the resonance that living souls generate in the warp when they experience the full spectrum of mortal feeling. The Tyranid hive mind does not generate that fuel. Individual Tyranid organisms do not have souls in any warp-relevant sense. Their psychic energies are bound to the hive mind, rather than free-floating in the way that makes mortal souls available for chaos to feed on. Killing 1 trillion Tyranid organisms generates as much spiritual sustenance for Khorne or Nurgle or Tsiench or Slaanesh as destroying 1 trillion rocks. The violence happens, but there is nothing behind it for the predators of the warp to feed on. The official codex records describe this dynamic with a passage that has become one of the more cited pieces of Tyranid lore among those who study it seriously. When Tyranid hive fleets clash with the daemons of chaos, neither race is granted sustenance. The inconstant warp stuff from which daemons are made offers the Tyranids no nourishment, while the unknowable alien entity of the hive mind is immune to terror and demonic corruption. Two super predators, tearing each other apart in a frenzy of slaughter for the right to consume or despoil territory that neither can actually use productively. But there is significantly more to this relationship than simple mutual futility, because the shadow in the warp changes the dynamics in ways that echo far beyond any individual engagement. The massive psychic disruption that the Tyranids project outward from their hive fleet does not just silence astropathic communication and make warp navigation impossible. It also disrupts the foundations of daemonic activity in the material plane. Daemons require psychic resonance to maintain physical form in real space. The shadow in the warp, in areas of sufficient Tyranid concentration, scrubs that resonance away. Not eliminates it entirely, but degrades it, makes it more costly to sustain, easier to interrupt. In practical terms, this means that areas under heavy Tyranid attack experience a reduction in daemonic activity. The same phenomenon that makes a Tyranid invasion so catastrophic for psycher-dependent civilizations also incidentally suppresses one of the other major threats those civilizations face. There is something deeply ironic in that, though it offers no comfort to the populations being dissolved in digestion pools. The Chaos Gods, for their part, are reportedly aware of this tension. There are references in the lore to the great powers taking a specific kind of interest in Tyranid invasions. Not interest in assisting the defenders, but interest in the broader strategic picture, in the question of whether enough mortal life survives the Tyranid advance to continue serving as the warp's fuel source. A galaxy entirely consumed by the Tyranids is a galaxy in which chaos starves. The mortal souls that the mortal souls that power the warp, that keep the Chaos Gods vital and the daemons capable of manifesting, would simply cease to exist in a galaxy reduced to bare rock by the Great Devourer. This creates the deeply strange situation in which the Chaos Gods might, at some level, have motivation to see the Tyranid advance slowed or stopped. Not enough motivation to do anything as cooperative as actually helping, obviously. The Chaos Gods are not capable of that kind of rational self-interest, but enough motivation to ensure that the territories they care about most remain populated, which means ensuring that the Tyranids do not consume everything all at once. For Khorne, the blood god, who demands blood and skulls, and the act of killing for its own transcendent sake, there is something uniquely and specifically unsatisfying about Tyranid opponents. The skull of a Hormigaunt placed on the brass throne means nothing. It carries none of the psychic content that makes a trophy meaningful in Khorne's framework. There is no terror in the creature's death, no desperate pride, no moment of recognition that something precious and individual is ending, just the switching off of one component in a larger machine. For a being whose entire power is built on the meaning of violence, the Tyranid's complete indifference to the meaning of anything is a kind of insult that the blood god has no framework to properly process or respond to. And for the Chaos Gods more broadly, the fact that the Tyranids are consuming worlds that would otherwise be generating faith and fear and ambition and desire, that every inhabited planet the swarm processes is a planet no longer contributing to the warp's tide, represents a quiet and ongoing strategic defeat. Every soul dissolved in a digestion pool is a soul that will never cry out in Khorne's name or despair into Nurgle's embrace or burn with Tzeentch's ambition. The Tyranids are not the enemies of chaos in any deliberate sense. They have no idea chaos exists as a concept. But the effect of their existence on the warp's food source is as damaging as if they had deliberately set out to starve the Imperium. The implications for our central question are this. The Tyranids do not fear chaos in any meaningful sense, but heavily chaos-contaminated territory sits in the hive mind's calculations as deprioritized feeding ground. Bad food, worth less than the cost of acquiring it. And in the hive mind's framework, bad food gets passed over when better food is available elsewhere. Section 6. The Octarius Catastrophe. When the prey fights back too well, there is a story in Warhammer 40,000 lore that begins as what a certain kind of cold and brilliant mind would call a masterstroke, and ends as one of the most catastrophic cautionary tales in the setting's history. It is the story of the Octarius War, and it contains what might be the most instructive case study we have of what happens when you try to use the Tyranids' biology against them without fully and honestly accounting for the specific character of the organism you are trying to manipulate. The story starts with Inquisitor Fidus Cryptman, whom we discussed in the biomass section. By 997 M41, Cryptman had been stripped of his inquisitorial rank. The cordon sanitaire had worked in its immediate objectives, but the price it had demanded had been deemed unacceptable even by the exceptionally flexible moral standards of an organization that regularly authorizes planetary sterilization. Excommunicated, stripped of resources and formal authority, Cryptman was nevertheless still alive and still thinking. He had an idea. The Orc Empire of Octarius was a problem the Imperium had been dealing with for longer than most people had comfortable context for. Octarius was a massive and self-sustaining Orc civilization, the kind that develops when orcs have been fighting continuously for generations, and the biological feedback of their psychic victory field keeps making them larger, more aggressive, more individually capable. The Imperium had been fighting Octarius to a grinding and expensive standstill, committing forces it could not spare to a war it was slowly losing. Cryptman's idea was to solve both problems simultaneously by putting them in the same room. He assembled a small team, a Deathwatch kill team, accompanied by specialists, and sent them to a world already infected with Genestealer cult activity. He needed live Genestealers, not dead specimens. Living, active ones, placed in stasis, psychically present enough that the hive mind could still detect them from a distance. The mission was successful at catastrophic cost to the team that executed it. Cryptman took the captured Genestealers and placed them aboard the Perdition's Flame, a derelict space hulk drifting in the outer reaches of the sector. He then destroyed a nearby moon, using the resulting debris field to alter the hulk's trajectory directly toward the Octarius Empire. And he stood back and waited. The hive mind sensed the Genestealers. The psychic signal of active Tyranid organisms is a beacon that the swarm does not ignore, because Genestealers are the advance elements of invasion, the forerunners whose presence in a system indicates a preparation requiring fleet response. A tendril of Leviathan, following that signal, redirected toward Octarius. It worked, exactly as Cryptman had planned. What followed became known as the Octarius War. The orcs of Octarius fought the Tyranids the way orcs fight everything, with enormous ferocity and a complete absence of anything resembling fear of death. But the greenskin biology did something in response to the intensity of this particular conflict that was extreme even by the standards of orc biological amplification. The orcs grew. Not metaphorically, literally. The psychic field that orc populations generate collectively, which strengthens and enables their individual warriors in proportion to the collective's confidence and aggression, was being fed by the most intensely violent ongoing conflict any of these particular orcs had ever experienced. The enemy they were fighting could not be demoralized, could not be frightened, could not be lured into a political settlement. It fought every single moment, without pause or quarter, and fighting that enemy, surviving against that enemy, was the most powerful orc victory narrative that any of them had ever been part of. Individual orc warriors began presenting with sizes and individual combat capabilities that startled the Imperial observers monitoring the situation from what they hoped was a safe distance. Warbosses were emerging from the conflict that would have challenged a Space Marine dreadnought in direct engagement. The Overfiend of Octarius was growing into something that the monitoring teams quietly agreed they would not want to face with anything less than a Titan escort. And the Tyranids were also growing, in their own way. Every orc consumed, every orc biome processed through the digestion pools, every orc biological innovation that a Tyranid organism survived long enough to have its genome sampled by the hive mind, was being encoded into the next generation of bioforms deployed in Octarius. The swarm fighting in this engagement was not the same swarm that had entered the system at the beginning of the conflict. It was an Octarius-specific variant of Leviathan, shaped by decades of continuous combat against orcs and it was visibly superior in terms of sheer biological lethality to anything that had been deployed before the war began. Thicker carapaces, enhanced aggression responses, nervous system architectures that could process and counter orc tactical patterns faster than the organisms of the fleet's main body. The Octarius War was not grinding either side down to manageable levels. It was creating a biological arms race between two of the most adaptive and resilient species in the galaxy, each one forcing the other to escalate its capabilities continuously, with no sign of either side approaching an equilibrium or an end state. When the Orc Overfiend eventually fell, the balance tipped decisively in the hive mind's favor. The collapse of the Central Orc Command Authority disrupted the collective psychic field that had been amplifying Orc combat effectiveness across the Empire. The Tyranid tendrils, gorged on Orc biomass and refined through decades of combat that had forced them to become more lethally effective than anything the Hive fleet had previously produced, began pushing outward from the Octarius sector. Not exhausted, not weakened, stronger, more dangerous than the same fleet had been before the war began, carrying biological innovations evolved specifically in the crucible of one of the most brutal and sustained military conflicts in the setting's history. The nightmare Kryptman had feared was realized with a thoroughness that his strategic calculus had not been able to account for. What the Octarius War tells us, in the context of our central question, is something sobering. The Tyranids can handle almost anything that fights them directly from within the space of biological possibility. The Orcs, extraordinary as they are, ultimately contributed to the swarm's growth more than they diminished it. The mutual attrition that was supposed to solve both problems instead created something worse. The Orcs represent the absolute ceiling of what biological belligerence can accomplish, and the ceiling was not high enough. Section 7. Hive Fleet Gorgon and the Tau, the limits of biological adaptation against pure technology. Of all the Hive fleets that have assaulted the Milky Way in the 41st millennium, Hive Fleet Gorgon occupies a position in the lore that is unique and genuinely fascinating for anyone who thinks carefully about what makes the Tyranids vulnerable. Gorgon was not the largest fleet. It was not the most strategically sophisticated, but it was, by every recorded measurement, the most extreme example of Tyranid biological adaptation ever documented. And its defeat at the hands of the Tau Empire provides some of the clearest evidence we have for where the limits of that adaptation actually live. Gorgon arrived in Tau space in 899. M41 as a splinter fleet descended from Behemoth, having fed on isolated and poorly defended worlds for decades after Behemoth's destruction at Macragge in order to rebuild its numbers. By the time it reached the Tau Empire, it had grown from a surviving tendril into a full hive fleet with its own distinct biological character. And that character was defined by an adaptation capacity that was extreme even for a species famous for extreme adaptation. Where other hive fleets adapted to new threats over the course of multiple campaign seasons, Gorgon was producing targeted biological responses within days of encountering a new weapon system. The hive mind had apparently directed significant genetic engineering resources into making this fleet a laboratory for rapid phenotypic change. The Tau encountered Gorgon with confidence. Their military doctrine, built around superior ranged firepower, applied from mobile battlesuit platforms while keeping the swarm at bay through a combination of speed and precision targeting, had worked well against every opponent they had faced before. They identified the largest bioforms, targeted them with their most powerful weapons, maintained careful spacing to minimize melee exposure, and began the engagement expecting a difficult but ultimately manageable fight. It stopped working within days, in the most unsettling possible way. The weapons kept functioning, and the hits kept connecting, but the carapaces that the shots were hitting had changed. In the space of time between the first wave contact and the second wave engagement, Gorgon had generated organisms with carapace structures that had been biochemically restructured to resist Tau pulse weapon energy output at the specific frequency and penetration profile the defenders were using. Not better armor in a general sense. Armor tuned to the exact threat. Armor that represented a targeted biological response to a specific technology so fast that it should not have been biologically possible by any model the Tau scientists had available. The Tau commander's response was exactly what you would expect from a species that has built its civilization on progressive technological development and tactical flexibility. They adapted too. They switched weapons, retrieved older Kroot pattern armaments that Gorgon had no prior exposure to, modified energy output parameters, introduced new systems from reserve stocks. Each adjustment bought time. Each novel approach encountered an organism generation that had not yet developed a counter, and each counter, when it came, was waiting in the next wave. The back and forth that followed represents one of the few documented cases of a Tyranid hive fleet being pushed toward its adaptation limits in real time. The Tau were not winning by conventional metrics at any point during the campaign. They were losing territory steadily throughout, but they were forcing the hive fleet to spend enormous biological resources on the production of highly specialized organisms in rapid succession, and there was a question that began to surface in the tactical assessments as the campaign progressed. Is there a rate of technological innovation beyond which even the hive mind's biological response cycle cannot keep pace? The answer Gorgon's defeat suggests is yes. Not a comfortable yes, not a clean victory yes, but a contingent and costly yes that demonstrates the existence of a ceiling even if it does not define precisely where that ceiling sits. Part of the defeat was structural. The Tau's information-sharing infrastructure meant that tactical discoveries in one sector of the front reached commanders in every other sector in near real time. When a new Gorgon bioform was encountered and analyzed, the counter was developed and distributed before Gorgon had finished deploying the bioform in question across all its attack vectors. The information loop was faster than the biological loop, though only barely, and only because the Tau were investing everything they had in maintaining that advantage. Part of it was the novel threat problem. Tyranid adaptation requires exposure and survival long enough for the hive mind to sample the biological signature of the threat and encode a response. A weapon system that has never been encountered before, that arrives in an engagement with no prior data for Gorgon to work from, enjoys a window of effectiveness before the response appears. The Tau had enough different weapon systems in their available arsenal that they could keep opening those windows, not forever, but long enough. And part of it was the combination problem. A Tyranid organism adapted to resist Tau pulse fire might be poorly suited to surviving railgun attack. An organism bred specifically to deal with heavy battlesuit melee capability might be more vulnerable to saturation fire from air assets. Building a single organism type that simultaneously resists multiple different novel threats is a compound adaptation problem whose difficulty scales superlinearly with the number of simultaneous novel threats being applied. The Tau, eventually reinforced by Imperial Guard forces in the later stages of the campaign, managed to present Gorgon with enough simultaneous novel threats that the adaptation response required exceeded what the fleet could generate fast enough to prevent cumulative losses from becoming decisive. Gorgon was defeated, not destroyed in the sense that the Necrons were avoided, not simply bypassed, actually defeated, the fleet's strength broken and its tendrils scattered or destroyed, at enormous cost, but defeated. What does this tell us about what the Tyranids fear in the functional sense? Gorgon's defeat demonstrates that rapid technological innovation, applied at sufficient rate and across sufficient simultaneous fronts, can exceed the biological adaptation cycle's capacity to respond effectively. The hive mind is not afraid of individual weapons, no matter how powerful. It is not afraid of a single tactical approach, no matter how well executed. But a technological ecosystem that can generate genuinely novel approaches faster than the biological clock can generate counters is a problem that does not yield to evolution alone. It requires something else. And what else the Tyranids have available is limited to more organisms and more aggression, neither of which addresses the fundamental problem. The Tau are also notable for something else in the context of this discussion. Their version of psychic capability is minimal compared to most other major factions. Their strategic infrastructure does not depend on warp navigation or astropathic relay. The shadow in the warp disrupts Tau operations significantly less than it disrupts Imperial operations. They can still communicate and coordinate while operating inside the Shadow's range in a way that the Imperium, with its absolute dependence on astropaths and navigators, simply cannot. This is a genuine strategic advantage in the Tyranid context, And it connects to a broader pattern that we will pull together in the final section. The things that most effectively resist the Tyranids tend to share a characteristic. They operate, at least partially, in spaces that the hive mind's primary strategic toolkit does not reach. Section 8. The Astronomicon and Holy Terra, the Great Lure and the Uncertain Trap. There is a mystery sitting at the center of the Tyranid invasion narrative that the scholars of the Imperium have never officially resolved, partly because the formal resolution of this mystery leads to conclusions that the Administratum would rather not have entered into any widely circulated document. The mystery is, at its most basic level, about navigation. The Tyranids came from outside the galaxy. They crossed the intergalactic void. And they are moving in a direction. What told them which way to go? The most credible theory, the one that keeps appearing in the encrypted assessments of the most senior Ordo Xenos inquisitors who have studied the question, is the Astronomicon, the great psychic beacon that burns at the heart of the Imperium, powered by the sacrifice of thousands of psychers burning themselves out in rotation to maintain its output, focused and projected by the mind of the Emperor himself, still living in whatever sense that term applies to a being on the Golden Throne. The Astronomicon is the lighthouse of human civilization. It makes warp navigation possible across the vast distances of the Milky Way. Without it, the Imperium's 10,000 worlds would drift apart into isolated pockets, unable to communicate or reinforce each other. And within a generation, the greatest human civilization in history would dissolve into chaos and desperation. It also broadcasts a psychic signal of extraordinary power across the entire galaxy and beyond. And something outside the galaxy, approaching from the dark, apparently picked it up. The implication of this, if you follow it all the way to its logical conclusion without the comfort of denial, is that the Imperium's single most vital piece of infrastructure, the thing it absolutely cannot function without, is also the thing that directed the Great Devourer toward us. The lighthouse that attracts not just the ships that need its guidance, but also the storm that will sink them. The secondary implication is equally disturbing. Terra itself, the seat of the Emperor, the source of the Astronomicon, the most sacred world in human civilization, and almost certainly the most heavily defended single location in the galaxy, is also the greatest concentration of biomass, psychic energy, and strategic value that the hive mind could possibly identify as a target. The hive cities that cover much of Terra's surface house population numbers so large that official records decline to commit to specific figures. Billions of people, perhaps tens of billions, in a civilization that has sprawled across a planet-wide urban megastructure for thousands of years. The psychic resonance of that many human souls, concentrated in a single location, amplified by millennia of faith and prayer, and the Emperor's own extraordinary presence, creates something that broadcasts far beyond the planet's atmosphere into the surrounding space. The hive mind, which navigates toward psychic signals of life the way a simple organism navigates toward chemical gradients, would find Terra the most compelling possible target in the entire galaxy once the fleet was in a range to resolve the signal in detail. This is known. The architects of imperial strategy know it with the kind of bone-deep certainty that comes from having no alternative theory that fits the observed behavior of hive fleets. Every major Tyranid incursion has moved inward toward the galactic core, rather than outward toward the halo. The heading is always, at the broadest strategic scale, toward the densest concentrations of life. And the densest concentration of life in the Milky Way, the singular greatest accumulation of biomass and psychic energy on any single world, is Terra. The Imperium's defense strategy in the broadest sense is organized around the terrible recognition that if the Tyranids reach Terra and establish orbital dominance, there is no military solution available. The defenses of Terra are extraordinary. But the Hive fleet does not need to fight through them in a single assault. It needs to arrive with enough biomass in its reserves to sustain a siege, and then it simply waits, recycling its dead, sending organisms in waves that the defenders cannot replace at the same rate the fleet can replace from its vast biological stores. The Imperium cannot let the Tyranids reach Terra, which means the entire strategic imperative of tyrannic war is not to defeat the swarm in any permanent sense. It is to maintain a sufficient defensive perimeter far enough from Terra that the Hive fleet is never in a position to establish unchallenged orbital presence above the throne world. But here is where the picture gets more complicated, and where the lure might be something closer to a trap than pure vulnerability. Terra is not simply biomass. Terra is the residence of the Emperor, and whatever the Emperor has become in 10,000 years on the Golden Throne, it is not a passive object. The Emperor's psychic field sanctifies the surrounding space in ways that are genuinely hostile to entities rooted in the warp. Daemons find approaching Terra extraordinarily difficult, not just because of the mundane defenses, but because the sheer weight of the Emperor's psychic presence creates an environment that is fundamentally inimical to warp-derived entities. The faith of billions of believers, focused by 10 millennia of continuous prayer toward a single location, creates a psychic resonance that amplifies the Emperor's own influence outward in ways that conventional physics cannot model. Whether any of this applies to Tyranids, who are not warp entities in the usual sense, is a question the lore leaves genuinely open. The Tyranids and the Emperor's Light are almost orthogonal phenomena, two different psychic systems operating on different principles. But the sheer density of psychic power concentrated on Terra represents a genuine unknown quantity, even for the Hive mind's considerable intelligence. The Tyranids have never reached Terra. What would happen if they did, and how the Emperor's presence would interact with the shadow in the warp at such proximity, are questions that remain unanswered. In a setting where the most significant events are often the product of interactions between powerful forces that no individual actor fully understood in advance, that uncertainty is itself a kind of hope, not a comfortable one, not one that any sensible strategist would build a defense plan on, but a recognition that the galaxy has resources, strange and old and not entirely comprehensible, that have not yet been fully deployed. Section 9. The Battle of Macragge and the True Cost of Stopping the Swarm. To understand what the Tyranids are genuinely afraid of, in any functional and meaningful sense, you must understand what has actually stopped them in the documented historical record. Not in strategic doctrine or theoretical planning, in the blood and grief and desperate improvisation of actual engagements. The Battle of Macragge is the starting point of that examination, because it is the most completely documented, the most intensively studied, and in many ways, the most revealing example of a successful defense in the entire Tyrannic War record. In 745, M41, Hive Fleet Behemoth had been advancing through the eastern fringe, with the relentless momentum of a species that had not yet encountered any obstacle it was required to think around, rather than simply consume. World after world in its path had fallen. Tyran Primus, the Adeptus Mechanicus research station that gave the fleet its eventual name, had been overrun in hours. The populations of system after system had been dissolved and processed. The silence that preceded the fleet's arrival, the sudden cessation of astropathic communication from worlds that had been functioning normally days before, had begun to be recognized as a specific kind of warning signal by those with the pattern recognition to read it. Marnius Calgar, chapter master of the Ultramarines, made the decision that would define his entire tenure and everything that came after it. He declared that Behemoth would be stopped at Macragge, not because the tactical calculation demanded it above all other options, though Macragge was the most defensible position available, and its fall would open the path to the heart of Ultramar and beyond. He declared it because someone had to declare it, because there is a point in every catastrophic situation where a human being has to stand in front of what is coming and say this is where it stops, without any certainty that they are right, on the strength of will and conviction and the refusal to let another world fall without a fight. Everything the Ultramarines could call in was called in. Orbital weapon stations were brought to combat readiness. The chapter's battle barges were positioned for maximum engagement range. Cruisers from the Ultramar defense fleet were integrated into the orbital order of battle. Even merchant vessels were pressed into service and armed with whatever could be mounted quickly. The polar fortresses of Macragge, ancient and thick-walled, and built originally to survive exactly this kind of assault, were reinforced with every spare warrior and every weapon that could be spared. Behemoth arrived, and the scales of the engagement were immediately and brutally apparent. The bioships came in numbers that turned the orbital sensors into static. They came through the defensive fire and kept coming because there were always more behind the ones that were dying. The mycetic spores, those biological drop pods, rained through the orbital fire in numbers large enough that enough reached the surface to seed the invasion despite the defenders' best efforts. In the polar fortress approaches, the first company of the Ultramarines took their position and held. What that holding cost, in detail, is a piece of the lore that rewards being read carefully rather than paraphrased into abstraction. The first company of a Space Marine chapter is its most elite formation. The veteran Terminators who make up that company are warriors who have survived decades or centuries of continuous combat, who wear the heaviest and most powerful individual armor available to the Adeptus Astartes, who have earned their place through performance in the kind of engagements where nothing less than absolute excellence is sufficient. They are the chapter's irreplaceable core, the institutional memory of centuries of war. Every single one of them died. Every member of the first company found lying where they had stood in the approaches to the polar fortress, their armor sealed around them, surrounded by the dead they had piled between themselves and the swarm. They did not break. They did not fall back. They held the line until the line was made of their bodies, and by the time they were gone, the orbital engagement had reached the phase where the fleet action could be concluded. Calgar himself was nearly killed. The Swarmlord, the Hivemind's greatest individual weapon, the most powerful and most capable bioform the swarm can produce, was dispatched specifically to deal with the chapter master. They fought. Calgar survived. The Swarmlord did not on that occasion. But Calgar lost both his hands in the process, their biological originals replaced afterward with bionics. He carried those mechanical hands for the rest of his service, as a physical reminder of the cost that stopping one Hive fleet had extracted from a man who had already given more than most could imagine. The orbital conclusion came through sacrifice rather than victory in the conventional military sense. Lord Admiral Wrath, commanding the battle fleet Tempestus warship Dominus Astra, watched the numbers in the space engagement and made his calculation. The remaining Tyranid fleet had moved into the rings of the gas giant Circe, using them for concealment and cover while they prepared the next phase of the assault. Wrath drove the Dominus Astra into the center of the Tyranid formation, not to fight, to detonate. He overloaded the ship's warp drives deep inside the Circe gravity well, surrounded by the densest concentration of remaining Tyranid bioships. The resulting warp implosion tore through the surrounding vessels with force that no biological armor could address, because there is no biological armor for surviving the tearing of the fabric of space-time. The remaining Tyranid fleet was shattered. What few vessels survived were mopped up by the remaining Imperial warships in the hours that followed. Behemoth was broken. And now let us look at what the victory actually cost and what it actually proved, because both things matter enormously for the central question. The Ultramarines lost their entire first company, their most veteran warriors, irreplaceable in the short term. The chapter master was permanently marked, his original biology replaced with bionics. Macragge itself was contaminated with Tyranid organisms that took years to fully root out and destroy. One Space Marine chapter, at effectively full strength at the beginning of the engagement, supported by a sector fleet that included one of the most powerful individual warships available to the Imperial Navy, fought to virtual destruction in the process of stopping one Hive fleet that the records suggest was probably not even the largest of the three that have since been encountered. And then, 2.5 centuries later, Kraken arrived, larger, smarter, specifically adapted around the lessons Behemoth had provided, and the war started again. The hive mind does not treat defeat as defeat. It treats defeat as data. Every organism that died at Macragge provided information. Every tactic the Ultramarines employed was sampled and encoded. Every weapon that proved effective was noted. Every weakness that was exploited was engineered around. Behemoth was the most expensive research program in Tyranid history, measured by organisms expended, and it returned findings that reshaped every fleet that came after. This is the thing that the conventional military framework of winning and losing cannot fully account for when applied to the Tyranids. Victory in a single engagement, or even in a single war, does not change the fundamental trajectory. The hive mind learns from every loss more efficiently than any other military organization learns from victory, because it has no cultural resistance to acknowledging failure, no institutional pride that prevents it from simply encoding the lesson and moving on. Information flows cleanly from disaster to Norn Queen to next generation of organisms, always without friction. What this means for understanding Tyranid fear is that the things which actually create lasting changes in Tyranid behavior are not the things that defeat individual organisms or individual fleets or even individual engagement strategies. Those things provide data. What creates lasting behavioral change in the hive mind is encountering a category of problem that does not have a biological solution, that cannot be encoded into the next generation, because there is no biological encoding that addresses it. And that category, as we are about to explore in detail, is much smaller than people tend to assume when they are thinking about the Tyranids in terms of power levels and weapons and tactical genius. Section 10. What the hive mind truly cannot adapt to physics, the Satan, and the thing that sent them here. We have walked through everything: the synapse architecture and its exploitable weaknesses, the biomass dependency that makes the swarm subject to the same biological constraints as every other living thing in the universe, the specific and documented challenges presented by the Necrons and their biomass-immune, warp-immune, Gauss-armed military machine, the strangely adversarial relationship with chaos that produces mutual futility rather than consumption, the extraordinary but ultimately limited adaptability that Hive Fleet Gorgon demonstrated against the Ta, the strategic picture painted by the Astronomicon and by the Octarius War's catastrophic feedback loop, the true and terrible cost that stopping even one Hive fleet extracts from the defenders who succeed in doing it. All of this is real, all of it matters, and all of it, when you pull back far enough to see the whole picture at once, maps to the same fundamental insight. The Tyranids are a biological system, extraordinary, optimized over millions of years, capable of consuming entire galaxies, but biological. And biology, no matter how refined, operates within physical parameters that it cannot rewrite. It can push right up to the edges of those parameters. It can find solutions to problems that seem physically impossible until you examine the biology closely and realize the biology is more creative than the problem required it to be. But it cannot step outside the space that the parameters define. What does step outside that space? The clearest example is matter-antimatter annihilation, Necron antimatter weapons, and certain other Necron armaments that operate at the fundamental physics level rather than simply delivering large amounts of energy in directed form, present the hive mind with a category of threat that biological adaptation cannot address. Not because the hive mind has not tried, because the threat operates below the level where biology works. When a particle of matter encounters its antimatter equivalent, they annihilate. 100% conversion of mass to energy. There is no organism you can breed that survives the conversion of its own mass to gamma radiation, because the organism is mass. You cannot adapt to not existing at the atomic level, because adaptation happens in atoms. This is the class of problem that the hive mind, for all its extraordinary capabilities, runs into and cannot solve through its usual methods. It can recognize the threat. It can attempt to minimize exposure through tactical means, keeping vulnerable organisms away from vectors of antimatter fire, developing behavioral responses that reduce the probability of an organism being hit. But it cannot breed an organism that is resistant. The physics do not allow it. The Satan represent an extension of this problem into even more fundamental territory. These ancient entities, the star gods that the Necrontyr made their terrible bargain with 60 million years ago, are not simply powerful beings. They are beings that exist at the intersection of the material universe and forces that predate the current understanding of physics. They fed on stars. They consumed the energy of stellar fusion. They were old when the first organic cells were forming in the first oceans of the first worlds to develop life. And their weapons, their capabilities, the Satan shards that the Necrons have trapped and weaponized, operate on principles that biology has no framework to engage with. The full Satan, before their shattering, are entities at a scale that makes even the hive mind's extraordinary intelligence seem like a local phenomenon. They consumed stars. They shaped matter with casual intent. They existed in a conceptual space that organic evolution never had to develop defenses against because such entities had not existed in the environments where organic evolution was doing its work. What framework does a nervous system built for hunting and eating biological organisms have for processing an entity that fed on stellar fusion? What biological adaptation prepares an organism to survive an encounter with something that has been alive longer than the planets themselves? The answer, in the evidence the lore provides, is no framework, no adaptation. The Cetan represent a class of problem that is simply outside the space the Tyranid toolkit was built to address, and no amount of additional organisms or more rapid adaptation cycles changes that fundamental mismatch. And here, finally, we arrive at the deepest and most unsettling answer to our central question. The Tyranids came from outside the galaxy. They crossed the intergalactic void on a heading that was not random, toward a signal they could detect from millions of light-years away. They arrived with the behavioral patterns of a species that has been doing this for a very long time: the advanced scouts, the biological preparation of target systems, the systematic consumption and the constant adaptation, and the cold intelligence that builds toward maximum efficiency. All of this suggests a species that has consumed many galaxies before this one. A species that is, in a biological sense, a mature and experienced predator of galaxies. If the Tyranids are experienced galaxy consumers, then the question of why they are here in this galaxy now, rather than still finishing whatever galaxy they last consumed, requires an answer. And the most credible answer is not that they exhausted that galaxy entirely, because a species this efficient at consumption would not be here if there were still food there. The most credible answer is that they left. That something in the last galaxy gave them a reason to move on faster than the consumption would normally dictate. What does that look like? What exists in the intergalactic void that is interesting enough or threatening enough to change the behavior of the most voracious predator in all of known space? We do not know. The lore does not tell us directly, and I suspect the reason it does not tell us directly is that the answer, whatever it is meant to remain at the edge of comprehension. A suggestion of depth rather than a fully described threat. But the shape of the answer is already visible in everything we have discussed. The Tyranids avoid the Necrons, the one major faction whose technology base operates below the threshold where biological adaptation is effective, whose weapons attack matter at the fundamental level, whose ancient Khitan weapons represent a category of force that biology has no response to. They route around places where the biological calculus comes out catastrophically wrong. They make course corrections in response to things that exist outside the biological space. Something in the void between galaxies, something older and more fundamental than a biological species, and operating at a level that biological existence cannot engage with directly, may be the answer to why the Great Devourer is here. Something that the hive mind recognized as a category of problem it could not solve through more organisms or faster adaptation or better synapse hierarchies. Something that made the calculation come out on the side of finding a new galaxy rather than staying in the old one. What that something is remains one of the Warhammer 40,000 settings' most deliberately kept mysteries. But the category it belongs to, the category of things that exist outside the biological space and that the hive mind's toolkit cannot effectively address, is visible throughout everything we have examined today. It is the category of things the hive mind comes closest to fearing, things it routes around when it has the freedom to do so, things it appears to treat with the kind of deep avoidance that only emerges when the cost-benefit analysis is not simply unfavorable but fundamentally broken, not worth fighting, not worth the expenditure, not a problem that gets better if you throw more organisms at it. The silent and terrible irony of the Tyranid invasion is that the galaxy they are consuming is already full of such things. The Necrons are waking. The Cetan shards are still out there, weaponized or escaped, representing potentials that no one has yet fully accounted for. The Emperor, whatever he has become in 10,000 years of dying on the Golden Throne, is a psychic presence of unknown and perhaps unknowable magnitude sitting at the center of the beacon that drew the swarm here. And out in the intergalactic void, whatever drove the Tyranids toward us is presumably still out there, doing whatever it was doing when they decided to leave. The Tyranids are afraid, in the functional and biological way, that a predator is afraid of an environment it cannot feed in, of the things that exist outside the biological loop. the things that cannot be consumed and cannot be adapted to through the mechanisms that natural selection provides. The antimatter, the fundamental forces, the things that operated before the concept of organic life, was anything other than chemistry. The void between things, the spaces where biology does not go, and has never had reason to develop tools for navigating. In a setting where the most optimistic reading of the situation is still deeply grim, there is something that is almost, if you hold it at the right angle, in the right light, approaching comfort in this picture. The Tyranids are terrifying. They are one of the most effective threats in all of speculative fiction, and everything about them in the 40K lore is built with the care and attention to biological detail that makes them genuinely scary, rather than simply large and aggressive. But they are not infinite. They are not beyond defeat. They are a biological system with the limits that all biological systems have, and the universe, strange and old and full of things that should not exist, contains forces that exceed those limits. The question that haunts the 41st millennium, the question that the Silent King is trying to answer, and that Primarch Guilliman is trying to build toward, and that the most thoughtful strategists on every side are wrestling with in between fighting for their lives, is whether those forces can be organized, whether a galaxy full of factions that hate each other and have good historical reasons for their mutual hatreds can be brought to act with sufficient coordination to present the hive mind with the kind of simultaneous novel threat problem that broke Gorgon, scaled up to galaxy-wide application. It would require the Necrons and the Imperium to cooperate. It would require the Eldari to prioritize something beyond their own survival. It would potentially require even the forces of chaos to find a reason to preserve the organic life they feed on, rather than simply corrupt it. It would require a level of galactic coordination that has never existed and might be fundamentally impossible given the nature of the factions involved. But it would work. The Tyranids have shown us, in the evidence of Gorgon's defeat and the Necron avoidance, and the specific categories of weaponry that produce responses outside the normal adaptation framework, that there are limits. The limits are real. The architecture of the hive mind, for all its alien brilliance, contains genuine structural weaknesses. The biomass dependency, the synapse hierarchy, the adaptation window, the inability to engage with phenomena outside the biological space, these are all real constraints on an organism that is otherwise genuinely difficult to constrain. Finding those constraints, exploiting them simultaneously, sustaining the effort long enough to matter, that is the project, that is the war. That is the question the 41st millennium is living inside, whether it knows it or not. And the most frightening thing is not that the answer might be no. The most frightening thing is that the answer might be yes, and nobody has managed to make the factions that need to cooperate actually cooperate long enough to find out. If this found you somewhere quiet, somewhere that the size of the universe feels appropriately close, drop a comment below. Tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. And tell me what section stayed with you longest. This is the kind of material that rewards sitting with, and I want to hear what it does when you sit with it. If you want more of this, the deep dives, the things behind the things, the questions that the setting raises and then deliberately leaves open, then subscribing makes sure you see it when it arrives. Hit the like button if this was worth your time. It genuinely helps, and there is so much more of this universe left to explore properly. Until next time, stay in the light. The shadow in the warp is already closer than the astropaths are allowed to say. Section 11. The Genestealer Cults. The vulnerability of the advance and what it reveals. There is a dimension of the Tyranid threat that often gets lost in the grand strategic discussion of hive fleets and planetary consumption and orbital engagements, and that dimension is the one that exists on the ground level, inside the societies of the worlds that are about to be consumed. The Genestealer cults. The pre-invasion preparation. The slow infection that precedes the swarm by decades or centuries, working from the inside, cultivating exactly the kind of internal collapse that makes a world's defense effectively worthless before the first mycetic spore breaks atmos. Understanding Genestealer cults, and specifically understanding why the Tyranids developed this strategy and what it reveals about the hive mind's actual vulnerabilities, is one of the more revealing angles of the whole discussion. Here is the thing about the cult strategy. On the surface, it looks like pure efficiency. A Genestealer, that fast and lethally capable advance scout, lands on a world decades before the fleet arrives. It infects a host through its genetic kiss, implanting Tyranid genetic material that begins rewriting the host's biology and produces offspring that carry the hybrid genetics forward through successive generations. Those offspring form communities, families, eventually organized groups who worship the coming of the Great Devourer, with the absolute devotion of people who have been neurologically rewired to experience the approaching fleet as sacred. They infiltrate positions of authority. They undermine planetary defenses. They prepare, systematically and patiently and with extraordinary cunning, for the moment the fleet arrives, at which point they rise and tear the defense structure apart from the inside. It is, from a purely tactical standpoint, one of the most effective invasion preparation strategies in the 40K setting. Worlds fall faster and at lower cost to the fleet when the fifth column has already done its work. The calculus makes sense. But look at it from the other direction. The hive mind is investing enormous resources in a strategy whose primary advantage is that it reduces the cost of the invasion at the point of arrival. And the reason it needs to reduce that cost is because a defended world that is aware of the threat and has its full military capacity available is sufficiently expensive to consume that the fleet's biomass budget benefits significantly from disrupting that defense in advance. The cult strategy is, fundamentally, an acknowledgement that direct assault against a fully prepared defense is costly enough to be worth avoiding through elaborate preparation. That is not nothing. The hive mind does not invest in elaborate preparation strategies for problems that it can simply overwhelm. The cult strategy exists because the hive mind has calculated, from the data of every previous invasion, that defended worlds with functioning command structures and loyal populations and intact communication networks are meaningfully more expensive to consume than worlds that have been internally compromised. The defenders who die in those longer and costlier engagements take organisms with them. The organisms lost represent biomass that cannot be recovered. The calculation favors the slower, more elaborate approach. And that means that every element of a world's defense that the cult strategy is designed to undermine represents a genuine threat to the fleet's efficiency. Functional command structures, loyal populations without compromised leadership, intact astropathic communication that can call for reinforcements, internal security services capable of identifying and rooting out genetic contamination before it reaches critical mass. Each of these represents something the hive mind has determined is worth spending decades and the resources of genostellar infiltration to remove in advance. This also means that each of these, maintained intact, represents a genuine and meaningful resistance to the most efficient version of the Tyranid invasion template. The worlds that survive Tyranid contact longest are almost always the worlds where the genostellar cult failed to penetrate deeply enough to matter before the fleet arrived, where the Adeptus Arbites caught the infection early, where the Inquisition's Ordo Xenos put an agent in position with enough time to identify the pattern, where a genetically paranoid local authority ran the screening programs that found the hybrids in the Defense Council before they could open the gates. This is not glamorous. It does not make for the kind of dramatic last stands that get carved into chapter halls, but it is arguably more effective, measured in lives saved and worlds not consumed, than almost any other form of Tyranid resistance. You defeat the cult, and you never have to fight the fleet at all, because the fleet will eventually move on to easier targets when the cost calculation is unfavorable enough. The harder question is whether the hive mind has adapted to account for worlds that have become effective at genostellar cult detection. The answer, based on the available evidence, is yes and also no. Yes, in the sense that genostellar genetics have been refined over generations of exposure to Imperial detection methods, producing hybrid phenotypes that are increasingly difficult to distinguish from baseline human through the screening protocols currently in use. No, in the sense that the fundamental vulnerability of the cult strategy remains. You can refine the infiltrator. You cannot eliminate the window of vulnerability that exists between the cult's establishment and the fleet's arrival. And in that window, a sufficiently informed and motivated defense has an opportunity that direct military resistance does not always provide. The Ordo Xenos understands this. The Death Watch understands this. And in the deep strategy of the anti-Tyranid war, the quiet and unglamorous work of cult identification and elimination is one of the most important ongoing efforts in the Imperium. even if it never generates the kind of battle honors that go on banners and chapter keeps. Section 12. The void between what the Tyranids are truly running from. Everything we have discussed across the preceding sections has built toward a question that the Warhammer 40,000 setting deliberately leaves partly open. And that open quality is not a flaw in the storytelling. It is the most important feature of the mystery. Because the thing that most effectively illuminates what the Tyranids are afraid of is not the evidence of what they avoid within the galaxy. It is the evidence of what lies behind them in the dark. Consider the implications of the intergalactic crossing one more time, but this time with everything we have established in context. The Tyranids are a species that has, by every available indication, consumed entire galaxies before arriving at the Milky Way. The sheer scale of their biological technology, the extraordinary sophistication of the hive mind's coordination system, the breathtaking efficiency of the digestion cycle, none of this emerges from a species that is doing this for the first time. This is the product of millions of years of refinement through the consumption of galaxy after galaxy worth of biomass and genetic material and ecological data. The Tyranids that arrived at our galaxy are the descendants of a process that has been ongoing since before our sun existed, and probably long before that. A species with that history does not cross the intergalactic void in a hurry unless it has to. The void is not a quick journey. Even at the fastest biological transit speed available to a hive fleet, crossing from one galaxy to another takes an enormous amount of time during which no feeding is possible and stored reserves are burning down. A species that optimizes for resource efficiency does not undertake that crossing lightly. It does not abandon a galaxy it has not fully consumed unless something in that galaxy makes the cost of remaining exceed the value of the remaining biomass. What could make a galaxy not worth finishing? What could present the hive mind with a cost-benefit analysis that comes out on the side of leaving? The category of answers is small. Anything within the biological space can be consumed. Biological resistance, no matter how sophisticated, has an upper limit beyond which it cannot exceed because biology itself has an upper limit. The Orcs demonstrated this in the Octarius War. They were the most extreme biological combatants the galaxy has available, and the result of fighting them was that the Tyranids became stronger. Anything biological, by definition, becomes food before it becomes an insurmountable obstacle, which means the thing that made the Tyranids leave their last galaxy was not biological. It was something that operates outside the biological space entirely. Something that the hive mind's extraordinary optimization tools, the adaptation system, the synapse network, the biomass recovery cycle, none of them provide any meaningful leverage against. The Cetan are the best candidate we have for what that something might be, based on the evidence available in the lore. Specifically the Void Dragon, Magladroth, the most powerful of the Cetan, and the one whose current status is least clearly established in the canonical record. If the Void Dragon still exists at something approaching full potency, somewhere in the galaxy, or somewhere in the void, its capabilities represent exactly the category of threat that the hive mind would recognize as genuinely unsurvivable, not costly, not worth avoiding for efficiency reasons, genuinely unsurvivable, the kind of encounter that ends hive fleets rather than simply depleting them. Other possibilities exist. The lore hints at things in the intergalactic void that have no names and no dedicated mythology in the setting, ancient entities or forces that predate even the Cetan, and that the current galactic civilizations have no framework for understanding or discussing. The old ones themselves, the most advanced biological civilization in galactic history, were ultimately unable to survive in a galaxy containing Cetan at full power. If things exist that the old ones could not survive, the Tyranids' extraordinary biological capability is as irrelevant to them as a Hormigaunt's scything blades are irrelevant to a Gauss weapon. What this means for the 40K setting's current state is both hopeful and deeply frightening, depending on which direction you look. It is hopeful in the sense that the Tyranids' behavior implies the existence of forces capable of threatening them. If something in their last galaxy made the hive mind decide to leave, that something represents a genuine hard counter to the most dangerous species in any galaxy. The galaxy the Tyranids came from still exists somewhere in the void. Whatever drove them away is presumably still there, and if the nature of that thing can be understood, Perhaps it can be replicated, or invoked, or leveraged in some way. It is frightening in the sense that what drove the Tyranids away from their last galaxy is presumably still pursuing them, or at minimum, is still out there, and the Tyranids coming here means it might come here too, eventually. The Tyranids are the storm that was blown toward us by something worse than a storm. They are the wave created by an earthquake that happened somewhere else, visible and terrifying and devastating, while the earthquake itself is still going on beyond the horizon. In the grim darkness of the far future, even the things that terrify the Great Devourer are part of the setting's ongoing nightmare. The hive mind came here because it had to, because something in the dark told it that staying was worse than crossing the void. And the void, as it turns out, led to a galaxy that contains the Satan and the Emperor and the Chaos Gods and the Necrons and all the other extraordinary horrors of the 41st millennium. Whether this is a better option than whatever the Tyranids were running from is a question that the setting leaves unanswered. But the question itself is instructive. In a universe where even the Great Devourer has something it avoids, the only honest conclusion is that the universe is bigger and stranger and more dangerous than any of its current inhabitants have fully come to terms with, including, in their cold and alien way, the Tyranids. Section 13. What survival actually looks like and why the answer matters now. We have spent a significant amount of time walking through the things that make the Tyranids vulnerable, the things that give the hive mind pause, the things that function as fear in a consciousness that does not feel fear the way we do. And the picture that has emerged is not a comfortable one, but it is not entirely hopeless either, and that qualification matters. The Tyranids can be stopped, not permanently, not in any way that ends the threat entirely and lets the galaxy breathe easy, but stopped in the sense of slowed, redirected, denied enough biomass to maintain their expansion rate, presented with problems that exceed their current adaptation capacity, stopped in ways that buy time, and in a setting where time is the only resource that matters, because time is what allows civilizations to develop the next generation of countermeasures, and the next after that. Buying time is not nothing. The specific mechanisms of survival that the lore has documented across the full history of tyrannic war all converge on the same structural insight. You cannot fight the Tyranids with what they have already adapted to. You must always be presenting them with something new, something that exists outside the category of threats their current biological configuration is optimized to handle, something that forces them to spend resources on developing a response rather than on advancing toward the next target. This requires a willingness to innovate faster than the Tyranids can adapt, which requires technological and organizational flexibility that most of the galaxy's current factions are structurally resistant to. The Imperium has spent 10,000 years calcifying around the principle that the old ways are the safe ways, and deviation from established practice is heresy. It is almost perfectly designed to produce exactly the kind of standardized, repeatable, predictable military response that the hive mind finds easiest to adapt to. The Aeldari have brilliance and extraordinary psychic capability, but their numbers are so reduced that they cannot afford the casualties that effective anti-Tyranid warfare extracts. The Necrons have the right tools, but not yet the coordination. Their dynasties still waking in isolation. Their great work still largely a plan rather than a reality. The Tau demonstrated that the approach is viable. They defeated Gorgon. They did it by out-innovating the adaptation cycle, and by presenting simultaneous novel threats faster than the hive mind could generate comprehensive biological responses to all of them at once. The Tau did it with a relatively small empire and relatively limited resources compared to the Imperium, and they did it against a hive fleet that was specifically optimized for rapid adaptation. If the principle scales, if the approach can be implemented at the level of the full galaxy rather than a single empire, the Tyranids are beatable in a way that matters. The question is whether the factions of the galaxy can set aside their mutual hatreds long enough to implement it, whether the Silent King's great work of coalition building can produce the coordination that Gorgon's defeat required at the galactic scale, whether the Lord Commander of the Imperium can find a way to bring the Necrons and the Aeldari and the Tau and whoever else might contribute into a framework that functions as a unified anti-Tyranid effort, even without shared identity and shared purpose that would make it emotionally coherent. The 41st millennium gives no optimistic answers to these questions. The factions of the galaxy continue to fight each other while the Tyranids advance. Opportunities for coordination that might change the fundamental calculus of survival get lost to ancient hatreds and immediate tactical pressures and the grinding bureaucratic inertia of organizations that have been doing things a particular way for thousands of years and cannot easily be redirected. But the lore is also full of moments where the impossible becomes possible under sufficient pressure, where enemies cooperate because the alternative is the end of everything, where individuals of sufficient vision and sufficient authority manage to impose coordination on chaos long enough for something genuinely new to happen. The Tyranids are afraid, functionally and demonstrably, of the things outside the biological space. They are afraid of running out of food. They are afraid, in the computational sense, of the Necrons and their weapons and their warp-immune infrastructure. They are functionally affected by the limits of their own adaptation cycle when those limits are pushed. These are all real, and each one of them is a door that a sufficiently organized defense can push open. The war is not won. The war may never be finally won, because the scale of the Tyranid threat from beyond the galaxy is so vast that winning one engagement, or one war, or even one generation of wars, does not end the existential question. But the war can be survived. The galaxy can endure. The things the Tyranids fear are also, in a strange way, reasons for hope, because they prove that the hive mind, for all its alien brilliance and all its biological perfection, has limits. And in a setting where everything is already as dark as it can possibly be, a confirmed limit on the most catastrophic threat in galactic history is the closest thing to good news that this particular era of the universe is prepared to offer. Take it where you can find it. In the grim darkness of the far future, the capacity to survive another day is its own kind of victory. The Great Devourer is still coming. The shadow in the warp is still expanding. The hive mind is still learning and adapting and growing and advancing toward the light at the center of the galaxy. And in every fortified position, in every desperate last stand, in every moment where a defender looks at what is coming and decides that this is the place, and this is the time, and this ground will not be given, something happens that the hive mind has never quite been able to fully account for in its calculations. Something that biological optimization, no matter how sophisticated, has never found a counter to. The decision to fight anyway. Not because the math says you can win, because some things are worth fighting for regardless of what the math says. And that decision, that specifically human and specifically non-biological choice to stand in front of the hive mind's cold calculation and say no, is perhaps the most interesting thing about the entire relationship between the galaxy's defenders and the Great Devourer. The hive mind optimizes for efficiency, for resource recovery and biomass acquisition and the cold arithmetic of biological survival. And it has never, in any recorded engagement, found a biological encoding that makes organisms choose to die for something rather than simply die. That remains, stubbornly and magnificently, outside the space where the hive mind's tools apply. Maybe that is the most important answer to our central question. The Tyranids are afraid of the things that exist outside the biological space. And the most persistent and most surprising thing that has ever existed outside the biological space is the human capacity to choose, consciously and deliberately, to spend everything in defense of something that cannot be expressed in biomass. The hive mind has been studying that for several centuries now. It has not yet produced an adaptation for it, and maybe, just maybe, that is because some things are genuinely not adaptable to. Stay in the light. The shadow in the warp is closer than the astropaths are allowed to say, but the light is still there. And for now, at least, that is enough. Section 14. The deep lore of the hive, mind, psychic dimensions, and the true nature of the beast. There is a layer of Tyranid lore that tends to get less attention than the tactically dramatic elements, the battles and the campaigns, and the heroic last stands. And that layer is the psychic dimension of the hive mind itself. Not in the sense of the shadow in the warp, which we have discussed at length, but in the sense of what the hive mind actually is as a psychic entity, and how its psychic nature creates its own specific category of vulnerability that is genuinely distinct from the biological and tactical weaknesses we have already explored. The hive mind is not just large, it is not just numerous, it is psychically present in a way that has consequences for the structure of reality in its immediate vicinity. When a hive fleet arrives in a star system in force, the psychic presence of the swarm is not a subtle thing. It is a vast and cold and alien intelligence pressing against the membrane of the warp, from the material side, with the weight of trillions of psychically connected organisms, all of them contributing to a gestalt consciousness that fills local psychic space with a signature so massive and so strange that it distorts the surrounding warp in ways that psychers in the region can detect from light years away. This is the origin of the shadow in the warp. The hive mind does not project the shadow as a deliberate weapon, in the sense of consciously deciding to disrupt astropathic communication as a tactical measure. The shadow is a byproduct of what the hive mind simply is. The sheer presence of the collective consciousness is so enormous that it fills the psychic space around it and crowds out everything else, the way a massive object creates a gravitational well that affects the paths of smaller objects. Without doing so deliberately, the shadow is the hive mind's gravitational equivalent in psychic space. This has a consequence that the Tyranids themselves are presumably unable to change, which makes it a structural weakness rather than a tactical one. The hive mind is visible. In the psychic dimension, it is unavoidably, enormously, undeniably present in a way that announces itself from an extraordinary distance. And there are psychic entities in the 40K universe for whom visibility is the precondition for threat assessment, the necessary first step before they can determine whether to engage, avoid, or simply consume. The Chaos Gods are aware of the hive mind in the way that they are aware of anything that creates large-scale psychic disturbance in the warp, not personal awareness, not the kind of deliberate attention that a sentient individual gives to a thing that interests them. More like the way that an ocean is aware of a continent, in the sense that the presence of the continent changes the patterns of the ocean's behavior in that region without the ocean having any conscious model of what the continent is. The hive mind's psychic presence affects the warp whether the Chaos Gods want it to or not, and the Chaos Gods in turn affect the hive mind's vicinity simply by being what they are. What this means in practical terms is that the hive mind cannot pass undetected through regions of intense chaos activity. The shadow in the warp and the Chaos Gods' influence in those same regions interact in ways that the hive mind cannot fully control and cannot predict with the confidence it prefers when making resource allocation decisions. The warp is, in regions of heavy chaos presence, genuinely unpredictable in a way that the hive mind's deterministic biological optimization has no framework for modeling accurately. There is also the matter of psychers. The Tyranids have no psychers in the conventional sense. The hive mind itself is a psychic entity of extraordinary power, but it does not manifest that power through individual organisms who serve as psychic conduits in the way that human-sanctioned psychers or Eldar farseers do. The zoanthropes and similar organisms channel the hive mind's psychic power through their biology, but they are not independent psychic agents. They are projectors, devices for focusing an external power, not sources of independent psychic will. This is relevant because it means that the Tyranids have no psychic intelligence network. The hive mind knows things through biology, through the sensory systems of its organisms, through the genetic sampling of encountered species, and the tactical analysis of observed behaviors. It does not know things through prophetic vision or psychic divination or the reading of fate lines in the warp the way that the Eldari do. It does not commune with its past and its future through psychic contact with ancestral consciousnesses, the way that certain xenospecies are described doing. It knows only what its organisms can perceive through biological senses and transmit back to the central intelligence through the psychic network. This is a genuine limitation. The Eldari's capacity to read the strands of fate, however unreliably, gives them a kind of strategic information that the hive mind simply cannot access. A farseer who correctly reads a likely future in which a particular hive fleet tendril advances through a particular region and prepares a defense accordingly is exploiting something the hive mind has no countermeasure for. Because you cannot adapt biologically to an intelligence-gathering capability that operates on a dimension you cannot perceive. The Eldar, diminished as they are, represent one of the few factions whose specific psychic capabilities create genuine blind spots in the hive mind's situational awareness, not because they are more powerful than the hive mind in any direct sense, but because they operate on a layer of information that the hive mind's biology cannot reach. There is also a broader point about the nature of consciousness that the Tyranid lore touches on in ways that reward careful attention. The hive mind is, by definition, a collective intelligence. Its individual components, the organisms of the swarm, are not conscious in any individual sense. They are components. They do not experience the world as individuals because they were never built to be individuals. The hive mind itself experiences the world, but it experiences it through a mode of consciousness that is so alien to individual experience that calling both things by the same word feels dishonest. Individual consciousness, in the way that humans and Eldar and Orcs and even Tau experience it, carries with it certain capabilities that collective consciousness does not naturally develop. Creativity, in the sense of genuine novelty. The capacity to make a connection between two things that have never been connected before, not because a calculation suggested that connection, but because something in the individual experience of each thing resonated with the other in a way that could not have been predicted in advance. The capacity for the kind of genuine innovation that does not come from optimization, but from the application of one domain's logic to a completely different domain. The hive mind is extraordinarily intelligent, but its intelligence is a particular kind of intelligence, the kind that is extremely good at optimization within known parameters, and extremely good at biological response to encountered stimuli, and extremely good at the deep and patient processing that produces the perfect organism for a particular tactical challenge. It may not be as good as individual consciousness at the kind of lateral thinking that produces a solution that does not exist within the parameters of the problem as originally formulated. The history of human survival against the Tyranids is, at least partially, a history of humans coming up with solutions that should not have worked according to any reasonable analysis of the available resources and capabilities. Lord Admiral Wrath's decision to detonate the Dominus Astra inside the Circe gravity well was not a solution that emerged from a careful calculation of the available options. It was a decision made in the space of a few minutes by a man who looked at the problem and concluded that there was only one move left and made it. The kind of decision-making that requires an individual rather than a committee. The kind of solution that the hive mind, running its vast parallel calculations, might not have considered because it falls entirely outside the optimization parameters of any biological system. The hive mind has never faced an opponent that thinks the way individual humans think when they are pushed past the edge of the rational. It has never faced the specific creativity of desperation, the way a sufficiently trapped individual consciousness can generate solutions that emerge not from any systematic analysis, but from the interaction between the problem and the entirety of that person's accumulated individual experience in a single flash of unexpected connection. The hive mind models probability. It does not model the specific kind of unpredictability that individual creativity generates. That is, perhaps, one of the most genuinely hopeful observations in all of this analysis. The Great Devourer is a perfect machine for consuming the expected, and the galaxy, to its enormous and costly credit, has never quite managed to be entirely expected. Section 15. The Long War Final Thoughts on a Fight That Has No Final Battle. We began this discussion with a question about fear, and we have arrived, through 10,000 years of blood and 10,000 light-years of space, at something that feels less like an answer and more like a map of the territory where answers might eventually be found, which is, in a setting as deliberately open-ended and perpetually darkening as Warhammer 40,000, probably the most you can honestly hope for. The Tyranids are afraid of specific things, not in the human sense, not with the subjective experience of dread or anticipation, or the physical sensations that fear produces in a biological body built around an individual nervous system and an individual survival instinct, but functionally, demonstrably, in the evidence of their behavior across every engagement and every strategic decision that the historical record documents. The hive mind treats certain categories of problem as worthy of avoidance rather than consumption. It routes around Necron worlds. It struggles with the specific category of physics-level threats that Gauss weaponry represents. It behaves differently in resource-depleted environments, showing the functional equivalent of stress that all biological systems show when their energy budget is under pressure. It has an adaptation cycle with a finite speed, and things that exceed that finite speed produce outcomes the hive mind cannot fully optimize around. None of this makes the Tyranids beatable in a comfortable way. None of it means that the galaxy has the resources and the coordination necessary to actually exploit these weaknesses at the scale that would matter strategically. The history of tyrannic war is, in many ways, a history of knowing the vulnerabilities and still losing worlds at a rate that has not yet stabilized, of finding solutions that work at the tactical level, and watching them fail to translate into strategic shifts because the factions that would need to cooperate to implement them at scale are busy doing all the things that those factions always do instead. But the vulnerabilities are real. The limits are real. The possibility of survival, even of something more than mere survival, exists in the structure of the problem in a way that it would not exist if the Tyranids were simply infinite and perfect, and beyond the reach of anything the galaxy currently has available. The Silent King returned from his 60 million years of exile because he saw the Tyranids in the void and recognized something that made him decide the war was worth fighting. Not because he thought the war was easy. The Silent King has been alive long enough to know exactly how difficult, impossible problems actually are. He returned because he saw that the problem was, despite everything, not actually impossible. That the specific characteristics of the Tyranid threat, the biological constraints and the synapse vulnerabilities, and the adaptation cycle's finite speed, and the fundamental indigestibility of Necron technology added up to something that could be resisted with the right approach and sufficient coordination. He could be wrong. In the 40K universe, even the most far-sighted and experienced entities are sometimes wrong about things this important. But the fact that someone with his depth of experience and his very long perspective looked at the Tyranid threat and concluded that fighting was worth doing is itself a kind of evidence that the fight is worth doing. In the 41st millennium, that might be the closest thing to optimism that the setting allows. The war continues. The hive fleets advance. The galaxy burns and breaks and holds and falls and sometimes, against everything the numbers suggest should be possible, stands. And somewhere in the void between galaxies, the thing that scared the Great Devourer badly enough to send it toward us is still out there, doing whatever it has always been doing, completely unaware of and completely uninterested in the billions of lives being spent in its shadow. That is the story. That is the war. That is the darkness, and the light that persists inside it, and the question of whether the light is enough. We will keep watching. We will keep going deeper into this universe, and everything it has to tell us about the things that make darkness meaningful, and the things that make light worth fighting for. There is so much more here to find. If this found you in a dark moment of your own, or in a quiet one, or just in an ordinary Tuesday evening that needed something to make it feel bigger and stranger and more significant than it was before you started watching, drop a comment. Tell me what time it is where you are. Tell me what pulled you here. Tell me what the Tyranids make you think about, because this universe is better when we think about it together. Subscribe if you want to be here for what comes next. There will always be something that comes next. Hit the like button. It matters more than it sounds like it should. Stay in the light. The shadow is never as total as it appears. And the light has never, in 10,000 years of the darkest future imaginable, gone entirely out. A note on the numbers. A brief word about scale, because numbers in Warhammer 40,000 are always worth pausing on. When we talk about the Tyranids consuming a world, we are talking about a planet with a surface area measured in hundreds of millions of square kilometers, with an atmosphere hundreds of kilometers deep, with oceans that reach kilometers below their surface, and geological formations that descend kilometers further below that. The sheer volume of biological material on even a relatively sparsely inhabited world is a number so large that it stops having intuitive, meaning the moment you try to comprehend it. The hive fleet processes all of it, not the rock, not the minerals, that cannot be converted efficiently into biomass. But every cell of every organism, Every unit of organic chemistry, every molecule that biological processes have organized into something more complex than raw mineral matter. Over the course of days to weeks, depending on the size of the world and the size of the deployed digestion apparatus, a living world becomes a dead one. When we talk about the biomass dependency as a vulnerability, we are talking about a requirement so enormous that even the scale of Tyranid consumption has an equal on the intake side. The fleet consumes worlds because it needs worlds. And a strategy that denies it worlds is not a small thing. It is a disruption of an appetite that operates on a geological scale. Understanding that scale is essential for understanding why the vulnerabilities matter as much as they do, despite the apparent impossibility of the problem. The hive mind is not infinite. Nothing is infinite. The universe has a finite amount of matter, and the Tyranids are subject to that finitude just as everything else is. The question of survival is ultimately a question of whether the galaxy can make itself expensive enough to consume that the Tyranids' resources are depleted faster than the galaxy's remaining defenses can be overcome. That question does not have a comfortable answer yet, but it is the right question, and asking the right question is always where understanding begins. The universe of Warhammer 40,000 is, at its heart, a universe that takes the question of what it means to fight for something seriously. Not in a comfortable way. Not in a way that offers easy reassurance that the fight is worth it, or that the sacrifice made sense, or that the people who died defending something did not die for nothing. The setting does not offer those reassurances. What it offers instead is the much harder and much more honest observation that some things are worth fighting for, regardless of whether the fight is won, and that the decision to fight is itself meaningful in a way that the outcome cannot diminish. The Tyranids, in their cold and alien and completely indifferent way, are the ultimate test of that observation, because they do not care about meaning. They do not care about sacrifice. They do not care about heroism or despair or the long arc of history that the other factions of the 40K universe are all, in their various ways, trying to bend in some direction they prefer. The Tyranids simply eat. They will eat until there is nothing left to eat, or until something stops them. And the thing that has, repeatedly and against all probability, stopped them or slowed them or cost them enough that they moved on to easier hunting has always been something that the hive mind did not fully account for in its calculations. Something that emerged from the specific and irreducible nature of the beings who were doing the stopping. That is the deepest answer to the question we started with. The Tyranids are afraid, in their functional and biological way, of everything that exists outside the biological space they were built to navigate. And the most consistently surprising thing that has ever existed outside that space is not the Necrons or the Cetan or the fundamental physics of matter-antimatter annihilation. It is the particular kind of stubbornness that individual consciousness generates when it is pushed against something it refuses to accept. The hive mind has never found a biological encoding for that. It keeps trying. The data keeps coming in. And every time a defender stands their ground when the numbers say they should not, every time a Lord Admiral drives his ship into a gravity well and detonates it among the enemy because there is no other move left, every time a chapter makes a last stand that was always going to be a last stand and makes it anyway, the hive mind adds another data point to a problem it has not yet solved. Maybe it never will. In the grim darkness of the far future, maybe the one thing that the Great Devourer can never fully consume is the part of consciousness that decides, without calculation, that this is worth dying for. That would be a remarkable thing. In a setting built on 10,000 years of darkness and sacrifice, and the grinding certainty that nothing ever truly gets better, the possibility that the Tyranids have found the one thing in the universe they cannot eat is perhaps the most hopeful sentence it is possible to write. We will leave it there, for now. There is so much more to explore.